Marxists understood not personalised power. These persons are symptoms of this, and to focus on people that are trying then you get about, you double the amount so strikes, bombings, deaths. You don't close Guantanamo, and you've got an ice crisis and you don't and that's just this one, this move, do you know?
Okay, so good morning. I would like to welcome everyone to our morning session. And in the morning slot we've got two speakers, Professor Monika Adamczyk-Garbowska and Professor Marko Pajewicz. Then there will be time for coffee and two consecutive presentations delivered by Susan Elton and Marjorie Armstrong. So let me welcome Professor Monika Adamczyk-Garbowska. She's a professor of comparative literature at the Department of German Studies and Applied Linguistics of Marii Skłodowska University in Lublin. And Professor Garbowska is an expert in Jewish studies, a translation scholar, and a practicing translator from English and Yiddish into Polish. And of course, she's famous for her 1986 retranslation of Winnie the Pooh. So, Professor Garbowska, the floor is yours.
Famous or infamous? Well, thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for coming, because I imagine that you could have slept in. It's Saturday morning, but so I appreciate the coming. So the topic that I will discuss today has intrigued me for many years, since the time when, almost 30 years ago, after studying Yiddish, I've been able to compare Isaac Bashevis Singer's works, originally written in Yiddish, with their English versions attuned to the American audience. So originally, I started reading Yiddish literature in English, but then with time, it really bothered me that I had to read it in English. So when I got to know Yiddish to be able to read in the original, I discovered lots of differences. While comparing these versions, I realized that a number of changes, modifications, additions, and omissions have been caused not by linguistic or cultural untranslatability, although such factors obviously also have been at work, but by extra-textual factors. Gradually, while researching and translating Yiddish literature into Polish, I also devoted a great deal of attention to translations into other languages, especially English, noticing that a number of common tendencies can be observed in various English translations of Yiddish works by different authors and by different translators and done at different times. A number of these changes seem to have been caused by a peculiar view of Eastern Europe, not devoid of simplifications and stereotypes. I'm not saying that all translations done from Yiddish into English are bad. There are a number of notable exceptions, but even in those well annotated and accurate translation, there are some common tendencies. In my analysis of selected translation strategies, I am going to refer to some concept proposed by Antoine Berman. Probably most literary scholars know this already a classic concept, but just since we are, like an interdisciplinary crowd, I listed them here. Berman prepared his model of translation critique on the basis of his experience as a translator of Latin American prose into French, but a number of the tendencies he distinguished are applicable to the Yiddish-English material. In his analytic of translation, he distinguished 12 deforming tendencies that can be observed in translations of literary prose, especially the novel and the essay. All of them, with various intensity, may be noticed in translations of Yiddish prose into English. In my presentation, I will make references to various works, but especially to Oyzer Warszawski's Smugglers. It's a novel published in 1920 in Warsaw, and its English language version, Smugglers. The reason for using this particular work as a source of analytical material is that recently, together with Magdalena Ruta, a professor of Yiddish in Krakow, I completed a Polish translation of the novel, and it will be published next year, so almost after 100 years after its publication. As the text is very complex, I decided to consult the French and English versions. While the French versions turned out to be quite accurate and helpful in solving some of the puzzles, the English one turned out to be fascinating material for translation analysis, but not really helpful for translation as such. What is important, the English translation was published fairly recently, in 2008, so it allows us to trace contemporary tendencies and juxtapose them with earlier ones. What's more, it was done at the time when Yiddish studies have been revived on a large scale in various countries, and rich internet resources and international cooperation of scholars make it easier than in the past to check various words and expressions. These factors, however, didn't help to make it closer to the original. Last but not least, the novel itself reveals most of the characteristics that Berman attributes to masterly prose, such as shapelessness, perceived as a positive factor, or lack of control, paradoxically attributes of bad writing. However, this is exactly this bad writing that makes this text so interesting and rich, but which also tempts translators to arbitrary homogenization. Other attributes of prose that Berman enumerates are drive toward concreteness, rhythm, as important in prose as in poetry, immersion in the vernacular language, underlying networks of signification, and superimposition of languages, including dialects in their relation to the vernacular. Since most of you probably have never heard of this work, I can add that this is a prime example of naturalism in Yiddish letters, written by an extremely talented young writer. Warszawski was only 22 when the book was published to immediate success. Later he wrote some other works, but none of them attracted much attention. As this is also a novel of initiation, with a number of juvenile characters and full of colloquial expressions and expletives, it could be compared, for example, to J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. I am a kind of Americanist. My background is in American studies, so this was one of my kind of impressions. And here, since you just a few slides, I just wanted to cover you the edition. This is the second edition from 1921. The first was in 1920, and then it was 1921, 1924, 1926. So this was really a bestseller. And here we have the front page. This was Smugglers, a roman in Drei Teilen, so in 3 parts, illustrated by a well-known graphic artist, actually coming from a family of painters, Josef Seidenbeutel. So there are these kind of very characteristic scenes with quotes from the novel. And here there is the French edition. Actually, since Warszawski spent a lot of time in France, he's mostly recognized in France. So this is actually a volume of collected works. I really recommend to those who read French. And the novel, the Contrebandiers, is just included here. And here is the English edition. And here you can see that while looking at the cover, probably most people would think of the smugglers in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's actually a misleading cover because there isn't much in the novel about children. The novel takes place during the First World War. This is something else. So, generally speaking, we can say that in translations from Yiddish into English, a number of embellishments occur that create a major semantic shift, transferring us from the accurately captured to a modified reality of the East European shtetl, civilized and modernized for the contemporary English language reader. Most Yiddish writers active in the period between two world wars, that is when secular Yiddish literature was flourishing, drew from European realistic tradition and placed their stories and novels in a concrete geographical and historical context. Even if they didn't use a name of the town in which the main action takes place, but referred to it as or the shtetl, they tended to use authentic names in the case of the surrounding towns, and if the action takes place in Warsaw, which is the case in numerous works, names of streets and other places are usually meticulously recorded. In English translations, on the other hand, such important landmarks are often treated as irrelevant details and are often skipped or distorted. Similar processes affect proper names and nicknames, especially Slavic or of Slavic origin, for quite often contemporary translators into English may know Yiddish, but they are not familiar with Polish or Russian, which are abundantly present in most Yiddish literature as the languages of the surrounding Gentile world. Sometimes translators don't even distinguish these two languages. Consequently, they skip or distort various quotes, sayings, and references in these languages, and thus the rich multilingual network is often disregarded or partly or completely destroyed. Not to mention that, as we all know, American publishers especially dislike footnotes. It's like what Barbara mentioned about Scandinavian translations or editions. For the purpose of my analysis, I tentatively distinguish 5 layers where differences are distinct, and these are topography, names of characters, elements of material culture, historical context, and multilinguality. So let's start with topography. Very often names of towns and villages are deformed while transcribed from Yiddish into English, sometimes to such a degree that it's not possible to identify or locate them on the map. The reader who is familiar with East European topography, but who is unable to read these works in the original, while reading them in English might think that some geographical names were invented, or that they result from a writer's bad memory. It is similar with names of streets and other places that are often skipped as difficult to pronounce or irrelevant from the point of view of the modern English language reader. For example, in the English edition of Szole Masz's classic novella Shtetl, The Little Town, we come across names like Jamoszok or Szenic, almost impossible to identify on any map. Only by checking in the original we find out that these are real places of Janosice and Siemieniec. And in these instances, this is not the case of using by the translated Yiddish equivalents of Polish names. This would be like justified. For example, like Kuzmir for Kazimierz on the Vistula, Ger for Góra Kalwaria, Warszew for Warsaw, but they simply use distorted forms. In Icie Meyer Weissenberg, a shtetl, which is polemical to Asch's novella, such topographic details as Der Milosner Wald, that is a forest near the village of Miłosna, Zakręt and Stara Wieś. These are well-known places near Warsaw, especially to contemporary drivers who get stuck in traffic jams on the Lublin-Warsaw road, were rendered as the Miłosz Forest, crossroads, and an ancient village, shifting the action from the outskirts of the Polish capital to some undefined, almost primeval or fairy tale territory. In Smugglers, even the relatively well-known city of Radom is rendered as Rodom. Distortions cover even a wider territory, because in this novel, whose action takes place during the First World War in Warsaw, there are references to various parts of the city and to criminals from such parts of Warsaw as Ochota, Wola or Praga. Praga is part of Warsaw on the eastern side of the Vistula. In the English translation, it is rendered as Prague, which may suggest that robbers from Prague come to Warsaw during the First World War as part of some kind of international cooperation between the underworlds of the two capitals. Another very interesting example is that one chapter starts on a narrow street in Warsaw near, it's, in Yiddish it's auf a Schmollgasse neben der Eisengasse. Eisengasse, ulica Żelazna or Iron Street. This is rendered as on a narrow lane in Warsaw near the railroad station. So it's a completely different location, not to mention that it suggests that in Warsaw there's only one railroad station. So I was always thinking that no one would shift a location, let's say in Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, or let's say Joyce's Ulysses, a pub from one street of Dublin to another, or let's say Central Park to Lower Manhattan, but if it's Warsaw, then anything goes. So now the next layer, proper names. The main female character in Smugglers is a young Polish prostitute, Nacia, which is a nickname from Natalia. Together with two other women, Stasia and Stefcia, much older than her, they get involved in the smuggling business with Jews from a small town. In the English version, they are presented as Natasha and Stiepka, so distinctly Russian names. In another scene, a woman from Warsaw called Stefanova, which means Stefan's wife or Stephen's wife, is turned into Stepanova. And the translator succumbs to an overdose of poetic license, presenting her as Stepanova, the woman of the steppes. So, adding an epithet obviously absent in the original. Another interesting example is that of a character whose name is skipped altogether and who figures in the novel as the loose woman, or else as the woman with the suggestive smile. In the original, she is Matejeche, which is roughly speaking Matthew's or Mateusz's wife. So she is a simple peasant woman whose husband is probably at war, and she supports her household by smuggling and additionally being sexually involved with one of the young Jewish smugglers. Because of the difficult conditions, all the rules of decent behavior have been loosened in the shtetl, so there is nothing particularly exceptional in her conduct. Her name itself, or rather being referred just by her husband's name, situates her in the universe of the shtetl. The usage of the expression the loose woman gives her a completely different character, turning her from a concrete into a somewhat symbolic figure like in a expressionist drama of the early 20th century. Now, some comments about elements of material culture. In the first chapter, still before one of the main characters, Pantel, discovers the advantages of smuggling, while listing things that he and his family need, he mentioned a Spencer for his wife. So it's a rather ordinary garment. In Polish we have a word szpencerek. In the translation it is replaced with a new brocade dress, so like for some kind of party. While in another scene, when the wife has got up quickly in the morning, she puts on a velvet robe. While in the translation, in the original, we have a kurze barchane halke. So that is a short petticoat made of coarse cotton cloth. Another problem is frequent use of the word bandana in reference to women in the shtetl, both Polish and Jewish, instead of kerchief or headscarf. So we also can place some reference to customs in this category. For example, one of the women in the shtetl constantly blows her nose. Just a reference. In the translation we read that she disgraces her family by blowing her nose into apron. So there is this, so on the one hand we witness this ennoblement, but on the other hand definitely impoverishment. And now historical context. One of the most vivid characters in Smugglers is that in which one of the inhabitants of the shtetl, a local tailor, recalls how thanks to his tailoring skills he was able to sew a patch on the coat of a Russian commandant in such a masterly fashion that it was almost invisible. So the good Russian commandant was so happy that he offered to fulfill his wish, and the tailor used this opportunity to intervene on behalf of a dozen of local Jews falsely accused of espionage. This was often the case during the First World War. In the original, this chapter is flavored with many Russian expressions, as the conversation must have originally taken place in Russian. In the English translation, not only is Russian completely effaced, but the commandant is presented as Polish, which is completely absurd since this happens during the First World War, more or less like 1916, maybe 2 or 3 years before Poland regained independence. In another chapter, we find a comment that the Jews missed the time when the Poles were in charge, because it was easier to bribe them than Germans, while in fact the reference to the Russian authorities now being replaced with German military forces. Now one more kind of curious example which shows that historical distortion occur not only in reference to the territory of Poland. For example, during the rise from Warsaw and back, smugglers tell different stories, and one of them describes the Caucasian mountains and Genghis Khan as a kind of this terrible story. In the translation we read about Kafkas, a man with a towering reputation as a murderer. So here the Caucasian mountains presented as a man, he was known as Khan. And finally, multilinguality. In the text written in Yiddish, where the action takes place in Poland, we come across numerous direct quotes from Polish that are often skipped or distorted in the English versions. Frequently, Polish words and expressions are used in order to mark the speech of characters, both Poles and assimilated Jews, or Jews communicating with Poles. For example, in trade contact, this is the main idea of the novel. There is a kind of brotherhood of smugglers, both Polish and Jewish. Most Yiddish writers assumed knowledge of at least 3 languages from their readers: Yiddish, Hebrew, and Polish, and additionally also some Russian and German, depending on the area and time period. So, for example, in the original version, no footnotes were necessary. A reader from 1920 would have no problems understanding this text. The translators into English most often impoverish this multilingual network. We can find numerous examples of such impoverishment in this English version of Smugglers, which in the original is an especially complex work from the linguistic point of view, as it contains a large dose of Polish, Russian and German. What's more, quite often the translator, instead of checking the meaning of expressions in these three languages, seems to be guessing and frequently misses the point. For instance, when a Polish peasant speaks, the translator puts in his mouth just one word, damn, supposedly assuming that simple folks have to swear, while in fact in the novels those are Jewish smugglers who swear in a most versatile manner. And thus a simple exchange of information between two peasants, and here I quote in Polish, this is in Hebrew characters, but Warszawski is very precise. He even renders the Mazovian dialect instead of standard Polish. So we have this exchange. Pantel jeszcze nie przyszedł, on pewno zaraz nadejdzie, which means Pantel hasn't come yet, probably he will come soon. Is rendered as Pantel is coming, says an elderly peasant. Damn, replies the younger peasant. Another interesting example from the scene mentioned earlier, where the Russian commandant is replaced with the Polish one, is that in the original, while praising the Jewish tailor, this Russian officer calls him patronizingly and condescendingly Haroshinki Żydok, a good little Jew, which kind of this expression renders, this whole kind of network of relationship in that period. In the translation, it's just skipped. And here it's an interesting example, very quickly. It would be this is one of the pages where when you see these four stanzas. This is the Smuggler Song, because this is one of the main ideas, that the smugglers create a song which reveals the philosophy of smugglers, and it's the depth of the smugglers' thinking. But actually it's a very simple song, actually written in Polish, slightly ungrammatical Polish, like z miasteczka wyjeżdżamy, na wóz szmugiel nakładamy, oj ci drybciu, cipciu, hop. So it's a very kind of rhythmical. In English it's skipped altogether, although it would be possible to render it as a kind of simple song. Here, for those who read French, you can see that we have this shortened French version, but it's still there. Sometimes the changes or omissions occur that do not belong to any of the above categories and that were probably caused by ideological reasons. For example, in one of the chapters of the English version of Szole maszy za sztetl that describes a Sabbath afternoon, a whole fragment was skipped that shows the violation of the Sabbath because of public stigmatizing by inhabitants of the shtetl a pair of lovers, a cook and a farmhand caught in flagranti. This might be a case of a peculiar type of censorship, as the translation was published in 1970, at the time when idealization of East European shtetl was a frequent phenomenon. As a result of some of these changes, mundane and often not very sophisticated reality becomes modernized, but on the other hand also simplified, deformed and deprived of meaningful traits. From the point of view of modern English language readers, this reality is still exotic and fits into the image of poor and backward Eastern Europe. But from the point of view of a reader more familiar with that word, a number of scenes or descriptions seem impoverished or neutralized, or in some aspects, neutralized or impoverished in some aspects and embellished in others, or sometimes simply grotesque. So it's like in Ubru'a by Alfred Jarry, right? The King Ubu, set in Poland that is nowhere. And such omissions and distortions occur not only in translations of fiction. In recent years, we've observed, both in the US and in Poland, an increased interest in Isker books, Jewish memorial books. More and more translations from Yiddish and Hebrew into English are available on the Jewish genealogy internet site. These translations are often made by people who know Yiddish and Hebrew quite well, but they do not know Polish and Russian. And the Polish historical and geographical context, and what is crucial, proper names are often distorted, which are very important in kind of recalling the names of the survivors. Translators are often unable to decipher Polish and Polish Jewish names transcribed in the Hebrew alphabet, and this results in various absurdities. What makes it worse, sometimes Polish translators use these English versions, and as they are often ignorant of Jewish culture, they treat such distortions as actual names. So actually it works both ways. Yeah, that the Western, let's say, translators or readers treat here the Polish reality as very exotic, or Polish Jewish reality, and the other way around, Polish readers as, well, Jewish names. Anything can happen. And this is my favorite example. It's an example how these things are, it's maybe complicated, but the idea is that it's very difficult to render some Polish names or Slavic names into Hebrew. So in the Hebrew it was written, and actually someone who doesn't know Polish can read it as Uca. Although, because this valve can be read as U or V. So someone who would know would read it as Efcia. But the translator read it as Uca. So we read, we have a kind of a nice nostalgic scene, and we have Uca, Ewa Hawa was a beautiful girl. And then the Polish translator also reads it as Uca and Ewa Hawa. So Uca sounds exotic in any language. And here when we have this Efcia, or actually it could be also Hafcia, so this shows, you know, the fact that probably they spoke in Polish, and this very affectionate name, and not this strange sounding Uca. Now, to conclude, what are the factors that determine such a treatment of Yiddish text? Obviously, we could complain about translators' incompetence, ignorance, and carelessness, but it seems that other factors are often at play. The Polish Jewish word is perceived as not only belonging to a distant past because of its destruction during the Second World War and the Holocaust, but something that's gone together with its geographical location. The question frequently asked by Jewish visitors coming to Poland, especially soon after the Iron Curtain had been removed, the question, do these places still exist? As if after the destruction of the Jewish communities, they had disappeared from the map altogether. This question signifies that the fictitious word, constructed on the basis of a word that was very palpable at the time these works were written, nowadays resembles the word of fantasy. The main difference is that in the case of fantasy novels, there are hundreds of fans who protest if some elements of the word they are fond of gets distorted in translation. While in the case of Yiddish literature, there are very few readers who can guard the authenticity of the historically grounded word captured in it. As Berman notices, translation is the trial of the foreign in a double sense. First of all, it opens up foreign works to target language readers in their utter foreignness. Secondly, it renders foreign works uprooted from their language ground, sold alone. In case of literature written in the Yiddish language, this process of uprooting via a highly deforming translation intensify its status, that is the status of the Yiddish language, as the language of exile, since there are very few readers who can read Yiddish literature in the original. Therefore, a certain dose of foreignization and annotation should be especially recommended in this case, as it enables a textual reconstruction of the destroyed word in all its richness. Well, thank you very much.
very much, Professor Karkowska. And now it's time to welcome Professor Marko Pejewicz. Professor Marko Pejewicz studied comparative literature, philosophy and Slavic studies in Munich, Berlin and Paris. He wrote his PhD on the poetics of Paul Celan and his habilitation on poetic thinking. And after teaching in Paris, Belfast and London and a senior fellowship at the Centre Marc Bloch, Humboldt University Berlin, he now occupies the abstract chair of German at Tartu University in Estonia. So, Professor Pejewicz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
May I ask just to
Yes, please, if you could do that for me, thank you very much. And yeah, maybe we do it right away. So I have a handout, no nice pictures, but for those who are bored with my talk, you can read a little bit, but it's in French and German, so it's just for the visual thing. It's really, we don't need it much, but it's helpful for you to get a glance of that. Yes, so my paper is entitled Huber, Rosenzweig's and Michonique's Bible Translation, Biblical Hebrew as Transformer of Language, Theory and Society. Yeah, we had already a bit of talk about the Bible and so on. This is quite different, but I think it maybe complements quite well what we have already said. So the Bible is obviously the text par excellence to demonstrate the cultural importance of translation. It is a foundational text for all Christian societies and has had a fundamental impact on the entire world. Am I speaking too loud or not loud enough? Is it okay like this? Yeah? Okay, thanks. I just get something quieter. So the Bible is the book, or rather, to refer to its Greek name, Biblia, the books in the plural. So the plurality of the Bible becomes also manifest, obviously, in its many translations, in spite of the existence of often one canonical version in most countries. In Germany, obviously, Luther's translations, or I should rather say Luther's, to stick to its German name, so Luther's translation occupies an even more prominent position, since it became at the same time the foundational text for a standardized German language, considerably shaping German and Germany until today. So in this paper I would like to present and analyze Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber's retranslation of the Bible in the 20th century. Many of you will be familiar with this very important endeavor. In view of its intention to have a cultural impact on Germanness with a foreignizing translation. So this translation attempted to create a version of the Bible which allows for a new access to faith and establishes a space for the Jewish Hebrew tradition in Germany, offering German Jews a new identity and creating a closer bond between Christian and Jewish Germans. So it was presented less as Jewish or sectarian, but as modern and universal. Buber and Rosenzweig pursued these goals with linguistic means, trying to find German equivalents for Hebrew notions and structures by developing innovative methods. After the first parts were published in the late 1920s, a lively debate took place in Germany about this ambitious enterprise, which, first of all, due to historical political reasons, was doomed already a few years after its beginning. The main target audience simply hardly existed anymore. When the translation work was finally accomplished, it was nonetheless a remarkable endeavor with great qualities, showing how translating foreign linguistic forms can shape a language and has the potential to considerably change worldviews. So I will then compare Buber and Rosenzweig's translation strategy with the one of Henri Michonique's Bible translation and with his theory of language in the wider sense. Michonique worked throughout his life on a poetics of society and translated the Bible and translating the Bible, was not only a fundamental and formative experience shaping his ideas on language and consequently on society. It was also the lever for his project to transform Western episteme altogether by integrating a way of thinking based on the rhythm of the Bible. Buber and Rosenzweig, as well as Michenik, were convinced that their translations can have an impact on the system of life. Despite Michenik's criticism of his predecessors, the parallels are remarkable, and both versions evolve around an interesting notion of rhythm, focusing on its semantic dimension, its signifiance, that is, its way to mean, so the signifying process of how sound and patterns organize language into meaningful configurations. So learning what language does from the original Bible via its translation is, according to Michenik, a means to change our conception of the subject, of ethics, of the political, of the individual, and of society altogether. Let's start with Buber and Rosenzweig. So Buber approached Rosenzweig in 1925 with a project to retranslate the Bible, which was to occupy the last 4 years of Rosenzweig's already then fatally life, and the next decades to come for Buber himself, who finished the translation only in 1961. So while Rosenzweig initially believed that any new Bible translation could only be a revision of Luther's version, Buber convinced him of the necessity of making manifest the hidden Hebraic foundation of German thought. As Buber commented later on, what was at issue was not details, but a system of life. Rosenzweig quickly became more zealous in this and that idea than Buber himself, stressing then the importance of Hebrew syntax, whereas Buber paid more attention to excavating the Hebraic content of certain notions, words. Rosenzweig wanted a translation now against Luther, transvaluing the Jewish within the German and demonstrating that Christianity has wrongly claimed Scripture as its own. The new translation was to overcome Luther by superseding its Christianism with a new Hebraic German, by setting free the original word, as he expressed it. Only in respecting the particularity of the Jewishness of the worldview represented in the form of the Hebrew Bible, Rosenzweig was convinced its true character and its universal value could be realized. This was meant as a kind of decolonization of the Bible from Christianity, which had radically altered its nature. From Christianity. So the consequence was to also free German from a too narrow framework and to realize its full potential as a multiplicity of voices, including evidently the Jewish tradition. Rosenzweig's criterion for the performance of the translator is that the translation must have changed the language. Buber makes the achromatic element, sound, more explicit. Language is always parole, so it should always be considered in its concrete speech situation. It is about hearing. Its tonality or voice is crucial, according to Buber. He grants Hebrew a key role in the meaning of the Bible. And he introduces the notion of rhythm as formative principle to describe its meaning-making principle. He defines rhythm as an acoustic connection of something that remains the same with a diversity, taking shape in a meaningful order. So that what remains the same, does so structurally by repetition of tone, intensity, measures, and also phonetically by repetition of sound, sound patterns, word and word patterns. The latter, the phonetic one, works by paronomasia, the former by meaningful changes. Buber presents sound patterning as meaning, rhythm as semantic principle. Paronomasia is then a poetic, that is a meaning-making feature, allowing for additional semantic richness through variation. This importance of sound of sound patterning is in paronomasia, alliteration and assonance should not be considered aesthetically, as Buber insisted. They, I quote, belong to the content and character of the message itself. End of quote. The correct representation is one of the innermost tasks of the translation, according to him. So he transcribes paronomasia as the use of several words of similar build or sound in such proximity that when the second or third appears, the first is still sounding or resounding. This makes these words connect in a particular relation. So paronomasia thus reinforces meaning for Buber. For translating, this means that the same Hebraic root in such repetitions needs to be also the same in German, and imprecisions would lead to wrong associations. That is often extremely difficult, obviously, and it necessitates at times the use of archaisms and neologisms in an audacious and at the same time obeying attitude. So that is why Buber and Rosenzweig put so much emphasis on sound and speech, on orality, Gesprochenheit. Any word is spoken word, said Rosenzweig. The rest is for them explicitly material and organization of speech. So that is what made them both construct an opposition to scripture. Rosenzweig wrote, Schrift is Gift, so scripture is poison. And both agreed on the necessity to translate it back into orality. Consequently, in order to reveal the natural rhythm of the Bible, Buber developed a procedure to divide language into cola, that is, units corresponding to the breathing of the human being. Buber defined them as natural articulation governed by the laws of human breath and human speech, into verses of meaning, each one representing a rhythmical unit. So the cola are not metrics, but units of meaning. This needs to be read aloud, obviously, then, in order to be fully appreciated. And of course, that's a Jewish tradition of reading the Bible aloud and together. So another invention by Buber is the so-called Leitwort method, or Leitwort-Methode, the leading word method, or guiding word method, by which he understood a word that is repeated in a text on a meaningful way. Following these repetitions allows for a better understanding of the meaning of the text. So the same word root is also sufficient, by the way, he mentions explicitly. This could even, in its differences, be favorable for the dynamic general effect. So it is the sentence, not the word, that is a natural element of speech for Buber. And phonetic connections with their variations form the meaningful rhythm of language. He saw in a measured repetition the best way how meaning is uttered outside from an explicit report. He thus created connections saying more immediately what is behind the described events, Buber states. So what takes place does so in and through language. That's his explicit claim. So Buber and Rosenzweig emphasize that it is all about rendering exactly was da steht, what is written there. That is, I quote, having emerged from sound, origin and meaning of words, from tone, construction and content of the word articulations. So saying it differently would have a different meaning. Wordplay is actually, Buber says, word seriousness. Taking the word serious, as it is. So the aim is therefore to strengthen the awareness of such unity of language in such connections and correlations. Buber even uses the term of Leiblichkeit, translate insufficiently bodiliness. The what cannot be separated from its how without damage in language. It is also important to retain that Buber considers not the word, but the sentence to be the natural element of living speech. The word only results from analysis. He thus introduces a notion of dynamics, by which he refers to the movement of coming and going between the interrelated sound textures. so that the paronomasia works over a larger textual space. To give you an idea of the form these principles took in their translation, here are a few examples. So just try to read it also in Hebrew. So for Anen Anan, translated by Luther as Wolken führen, so carrying clouds, Huber and Rosenzweig made Wolken Wölken. So that's a neologism, but it keeps the close connection of noun and verb of the original. For Taruach Tevach, in Luther's simply Schlachten, to slaughter, Huber and Rosenzweig give Schlachtvieh schlachten. So again, respecting the Hebrew construction and this reduplication, and that in spite or because of this reduplication. So it gets slightly more problematic when they translate a lot in Luther Brandopfer opfern, so there Luther also respects this reduplication. It would be sacrificed by fire, as Höhungen höhen, so height and heights, which really does not make much sense in German. It's very difficult to see, perceive in this translation the idea of sacrifice. But Buber and Rosenzweig argue that in Hebrew there's actually no fire nor sacrifice, because the sacrifice has today connotations which were completely alien to the Hebrew at the time. So for Kedesha, last example, Luther used Hure, so whore, which is too vulgar for Huber and Rosenzweig since it comes from Kadosh, holy, consecrated. And that is the reason why they translate it as Weihbule, which clearly has a very archaic sound in German, but it implies the context of the temple and consecration. So even the names had to stay Hebrew, since otherwise their root meaning gets lost. So they kept, we just set that example here, they kept to Chava instead of Germanizing it into Eva, in order to keep this meaning, which is life. But of course no German would have any clue about Chava as a name, I've never heard of it, whereas Eva is immediately present. So now you have this example there of the translation to get an idea about how it looked. So we don't have to read it really very much. It's not about the German as such here. It's just to give you an idea how they presented that, because that is important due to this Kohler technique. So each line is one breath. I read it to you anyway in German. Im Anfang schuf Gott den Himmel und die Erde. Die Erde aber war Irrsal und Wirrsal. Finsternis über Urwirbels Antlitz. Braus Gottes schwingend über dem Antlitz der Wasser. Gott sprach, Licht werde, Licht ward. So very obviously this is the beginning of the Genesis, and everybody knows that text very well, and it differs very much from Luther's translation, and particularly certain word choices created a lot of discussion and debate. So Irsal and Wirsal, for instance, shall structurally render Tohu Vabohu. But Urwirbels Antlitz was considered very difficult to fathom and also artificial. Luther simply translated that as Tiefe, depth. And Braus Gottes was associated by some to in Saus und Braus leben, which means somehow a situation of debauchery. So which was for them then not suitable for Ruach, the pneuma, the spirit. All of this is predominantly on the level of word choices. But the Kohler presentation, the lines according to the length of breath, organizes the entire text according to rhythmic aspects. This is, by the way, an element which gets completely lost in the internet. So there's an internet version of that, where the text is just one text like that without alinea. So it completely transforms the entire idea of this Bible. Buber and Rosenzweig claimed that they had to translate simply what was written in Hebrew. Siegfried Krakauer, a very famous critic, criticized in 1926, after the first publication of the first part, that their translation was not in tune with the times and sounded Wagnerian, as he said. For Buber and Rosenzweig, this criticism, however, was a criticism of the Hebrew text and not of their translation, he said. So the alliterations and reduplications, which indeed exist in Wagner, are not Wagnerian, they insisted, but essentiality and spirituality of the word, they are an essential part of any human speech. That also meant to avoid accidental alliterations in German, which were not in the Hebrew text. So they agreed that archaization is wrong and wanted to be entirely in the present, but for doing so, they claimed the recourse to things lost is indispensable. But of course, this intention to revitalize German from its roots was in the air, and Wagner indeed made an early attempt at that, and others followed, such as Stefan George, Rudolf Borchardt, and Martin Heidegger, as Klaus Reichert has pointed out. The critics of the translation were mostly assimilated Jews and analysts of society, for whom religion was a remote illusion, so that Buber and Rosenzweig seemed esoteric to them. As international intellectuals with a political, sociological approach, they were concerned about the parallels to nationalist movements in Germany. Reichert asks then whether it is possible to separate language from its historical context, and suggests that maybe we are only now capable to value the merits of this translation. In any case, it is true that Buber and Rosenzweig's Bible was an eminently philosophical enterprise. They wanted to connect two cultures, 2,000 years apart, by changing the awareness of language and by making Hebrew elements more sensible to the German readership. They not only wanted to address modern German Jews and enable them to reconnect with their tradition and their faith, they wanted to change German language altogether, freeing it from the Christian dominance imposed by Luther and working on a conception of life that reintegrates the materiality of language into reason, implying a change of the entire episteme. So 1961, Buber reacted to Scholen's remark that his language utopia in the Bible translation failed after National Socialism by affirming that he wanted to re-educate, that he wanted to educate in the sense of hearing language. And so educate people in hearing language. Being normally radically opposed to any missionary work, he claimed, in this case he is in favor of it, since it is not about Judaism and Christianity, but about the common original truth of which depends the future of both. So which depends the future, it's quite a big claim that he makes here. So that means that for Buber, their Bible translation had far-reaching ambitions. It trains the ear to hear the functioning of language beyond the mere meaning of words. Language awareness is a mission to better understand not only religious revelation, but more so how the functioning of biblical Hebrew connects body and mind, past and present, Jewishness and Christianity. I now come to Henri Michonique, who lived from 1932 to 2009. We mentioned him already, so he was James and mine director of research in Paris. So Michonique pursued the same idea about the semantic dimension of the body language, of the body of language. So he was a language thinker, a Bible translator, and a poet who, in his theory of language, developed throughout his lifetime a theory of society. So more precisely, actually, he intended his theory of language to be a theory of society. So his starting point, the trigger of his ideas, of his entire school of rhythm, was his experience of translating the Bible. That is, translating, incorporating another way of thinking, the one of biblical Hebrew, was for him a revelation about what language does with us and we with language. And what that means for our being as humans and for life and society. So again, a very, very big claim here. Michonique referred often to Buber and Rosenzweig's translation. As one of the important translations of the Bible he compared his own work with. Generally rather critically, by the way, but without going more into detail. In discussing Michonique's translation theory, quite quickly now, I will show that the parallels in their ideas go further than Michonique admitted, and in how far Michonique's underlying language theory indeed is a theory of society and rightly claimed its fundamental importance for a change in the episteme and consequently in worldview. So he is in line with Rosenzweig and Buber's ambition to change the course of culture by reintroducing the original way of language thinking in the Hebrew Bible, which, in his view as well, was covered up by Christian theology in the existing translations. He called this an enaction, and linguistic imperialism. These are his terms. He presented the functioning of language in the Bible as the theoretical lever for the entire theory of language. His claim that this would alter our philosophical ideas and hence the entire episteme becomes evident in the title of one of his books, Un coup de Bible dans la philosophie, donc a punch of the Bible in philosophy. Difficult to translate it. So the challenge is consequently to make this functioning transparent and to render it in translation. So that would then lead to another theory of language, and Michonique believed to another conception of how human beings and society function. So as Rosenzweig and Buber, Michonique stressed the orality of the Bible and the Jewish tradition of reading it aloud. There is, however, a difference since Michonique made of orality a key notion in his theory, overcoming the opposition of the written and the oral. Orality for him reaches its highest intensity rather in the written, in literature, since that is the maximal subjectivation of an individual in its rhythm. Orality is in Michonique's theory not sound, but becomes a manifestation of the subject, which invents itself in speaking. Now, what is this particularity of the biblical? How does it really manifest this orality? According to Michonique, in biblical Hebrew, there is a general rhythmization of language based on a complex system of rhythmic accents, the theamim. They are an organization of the sense of discourse, not of the word, by a system of 18 disjunctive and 8 adjunctive accents. So as a rhythmical organization of discourse, for Michonique, they are as much part of meaning as the meaning of words. The rhythmic accents establish the reason itself of the text he formulates. So the term ta'am, singular of te'amim, itself is the parable of the language body, as Michonique pointed out at several occasions. It means taste and reason. The taste of what is in the mouth, the savor, and the savor is the reason for what is said. So the physicality, even sensuality of language and meaning are one. This is key to how he understands rhythm. And that is why he calls for a general ta'amization of language and of our way of thinking, of our episteme altogether. To connect the subject with its form, to reconnect meaning and language body, and thus to finally really overcome the separation of content and form. Coming from this semanticizing accent system, he criticized the exclusivity of the sign in the theory of language and hermeneutics, which for him reduce language to meaning based on the sign. So if one thinks within the parameter of the sign, which is discontinuous and separates signifier and signified, granting primacy to the signified, one cannot see, or rather hear, that there is also a continuous in language. That is the serial organization of movement in speech. The biblical, with its rhythmical organization and its value of regroupings and degroupings, forces us to think differently, to hear what the sign, on the level of the word, cannot hear. So Michonique works with Émile Benveniste's notion of discourse to render this more accessible. In discourse, the sentence is the smallest unit of meaning, and the notion emphasizes the historical and cultural situation of each moment of speech. This means that language in the general sense of la langue does not really exist for Michonique, but it manifests itself only in discourse, in the concrete individual speech. On this basis, Michonique can affirm that one does not translate languages, but only discourses of a language. In language generally, as in translating, only discourse counts for Michonique as a historically positioned activity that transforms language and creates the subject. So Michonique shifts the focus from what a text says to what a text does. And that is what needs to be translated, the doing of the text. So if one wants to translate what a poem does to its language, one has to invent in the target language discourse equivalences: prosody, metaphor, wordplay, rhythm. They all need to be taken into account and rendered in order to translate the continuous of language, le continu. So now I would like to give you at least a short example of Michonique's Bible translation. So this is again a short extract of the same part. Au commencement is his translation of the Genesis. So I read that to you as well. And you see how it is articulated here. Au commencement, que Dieu a créé le ciel et la terre. Et la terre était vaine et vide, et l'ombre sur la face du gouffre. Et le souffle de Dieu couvre sur la face de l'eau. Et Dieu a dit qu'il y ait la lumière. Il y a eu la lumière. So what strikes immediately is the spacing. These hierarchical spaces are Michonique's method to render les tiamim, so the accent system. An internal alinea in the verse for the accent that equals the main caesura of the verse, large and small spaces then for the other 15 disjunctive accents depending on their value. The 8 conjunctive accents are not marked, apart from at times the absence of comma. Michonique understands these spaces less as metronomic pauses and more like reactivations, connections or deconnections. That is a matter of intonation, but not of metrics. At times a single word gains a very strong position by forming a unit, separated from the rest by empty spaces. Indeed, in contrast to Buber Rosenzweig, Michonique's translation is very simple and natural on the level of the words. But here, particularly with the repetition of the initial E, or end, of the sentences, it does a lot on the level of the sentence structure and of rhythm. So there are also many appositions stressed by the same procedure, often producing syntactic violence, as Michonique admits and intends, in the service of the original in order not to banalize it. Michonique wants to keep what he calls a semantics of position. Then, instead of aligning the syntax by saying, for instance, his enemies will bite the dust, he would say, following the original as well, and his enemies, the dust they will bite. There's a difference also between and he will be like a tree, and, with this little gap there, and he will be like a tree. Completely different meaning. So in the second version, of course, being gains in importance, and only then the tree comes into play. This sentence actually can mean very different things. At times in his translation, then, the semantic of sound even primes over the meaning of the word. So all of this creates a feeling of orality. He calls his typography the visualization of orality. He wants to make the reader hear the Hebrew in his translation. Michonique quite harshly criticized Buber and Rosenzweig, saying that they do not have the right concepts to think discourse and poetics, and that the biblical rhythm is absent in their translation. He likes very drastic formulations and is quite dismissive, unfortunately. But it is true that they do not mention the Theamim, but as we have seen, even if Buber in his examples for their procedures remains quite often on the level of concepts, of Leitwörter, rather than meaning-making through sound, he very clearly goes beyond the unit of the word in his understanding of how signifiance, meaning-making procedures, function. Huber also talks about colometry as an organization of speech according to breath length, and about dynamics as paranomasia over larger textual spaces. So for this, Huber even uses the term of rhythm. No doubt, Michnik went further with his theory of translation and of rhythm, but he could have found allies in Huber and Rosenzweig instead of dismissing them. So beyond the obvious fact that translated texts become part of culture and hence shape society as any other cultural product, much more so in the case of the Bible, why is this practice of translating relevant for society? It is the case because it shows the limits and problems of a conception of language based on the sign. It shows that the sign is only one element of language, and that there is more to language and to how meaning emerges. Considering rhythm and the continuous of language could establish a paradigm which enables to see the world in its flow and its togetherness instead of in oppositions. So it thereby challenges our society's conception of meaning making and of representation, with the potential of changing our episteme as a whole. That is, our conception of the world, our world view. And since that is our access to the world, in the last instance, it changes our world. Thank you very much.
We'd like to have a discussion now, and we will have a discussion, but we need to finish by 11 at the latest. That's what the coffee people say. You would think that I'm the boss here. Ain't the case. The coffee people who pull the strings. They're nice people, but they are very disciplined. So we have about 25 minutes for discussion, and then we have coffee. And I'd like us to start the next session half past 11, which means we'll have 20 minutes for coffee.
Okay, right. So I would like to thank Professor Marko Bajewicz and Professor Adam Czekarbowska. Now the floor is open for discussion. Professor Gawrońska?
Well, it's not a question, but rather a comment. Thank you for two wonderful talks. When you talked about translation of Warszawski into English, you mentioned that the Jewish culture is rendered quite faithfully, but strange things happen to the Polish and the Russian elements. And I just wanted to mention that I observed exactly the same thing in translation of Isa Paszewicz's Singer into Swedish. Most of them were done in the early 80s after he received the Nobel Prize. And at this time, the Swedish publishers were not as reluctant with regard to glossaries and notes as they are now. So most of Swedish translations of Singer contain glossaries with Yiddish terms and Hebrew terms, but to the Polish and Russian culture, strange thing happened. And I just wanted to mention especially very peculiar things that happen to Polish food. So, for example, in the Muscat family, there is a situation where people are invited for a Sunday dinner, and the mother in the house tells them that, the original situation, flakis on the stole, so the tripe is on the tables, come out. But in the Swedish translation, word for word, they say, come on, the cow's stomach is on the table. Gives another peculiar picture of, and people also eat beef with porridge, and other strange things. So this seems not to be restricted to English. So generally the translators are concerned with Jewish culture and disregard the Slavic cultures?
Well, I've written a lot about this, comparing the Bashevis singers' translations, so the problem is here with the Swedish translations that they were done via English,
Yes,
and
of course,
that's
yes.
where lots of these changes occur. My favorite example, actually, gave a paper on this, the type coffee or chicken soup. Because quite often, there are these scenes in East European shtetl that you enter the kitchen and you smell chicken soup, joich in rosół. So this is something that can be easily translated. And it kind of gives this kind of image. End of the 19th century, there's this slow boiling bouillon, chicken stock. And quite often it's translated with coffee, freshly brewed coffee. Probably, the editors encouraged Bashevis Zinger, who agreed to accept all these changes because first of all he wanted to be read. So he made all of these concessions and it's kind of more pleasant. But it shifts the kind of the image from, let's say, European shtetl to modern America, right? Freshly brewed coffee. So there are lots of such changes. I wouldn't say that in Warszawski's novel that the Yiddish, that the Jewish culture is treated so well either, because it's also distorted. It's less distorted than Slavic element, but still, because for example, these examples that I gave about the garments, the dresses, this Jewish woman would be wearing. So here it's this kind of simple garments that actually there weren't so many differences between some of the peasant customs and Jewish customs among this kind of lower strata of the society. And here it's kind of elevated. So yeah, but there are lots of changes in terms of food. This is a kind of different topic. Again, a kind of funny example. I remember that in the English translations they serve in a kind of Jewish household cabbage with cream of tartar. This was translated because cream of tartar is this kind of thing, acidy thing that is used actually mainly for baking, but the idea was that this was that this cabbage, it wasn't sauerkraut, but this was made sour. And the Polish translator translated this as kapusta z kremem. So it's a sweet cream. So and this was published in Polish, because that's exactly what I mentioned. It works both ways. That there is some Polish editors or Polish editors saying, well, who knows what these Jews eat? Maybe it's cabbage with sweet cream. So to była zakwaszana kapusta, prawda? Czy kapusta na kwasie. So.
Thanks very much for the talks that were terrific, really, really exciting. And I've got questions for both of you. First, Monica. At first I thought you were going to talk about how you translate bad writing, which is a really fascinating, really interesting question. But instead it was about a really, really bad translation of the paper. But I'm still a little curious about how much your talk was about a very bad translation. This was an American publishing house?
Actually, this was published in Israel.
It was published in Israel.
So I have the book if you want to have a look.
Yeah, well, I was curious about how much you knew about the publishing house, and I was also wondering about why it was translated when it was translated. 2008, I think you said, right? So, why was it translated in 2008? But getting back to the first question, I'm curious about how much this talk is about the peculiarities of an especially bad translation versus more general translating practices into English. And as I said, I thought this was an American publishing house, but it's not. Mm-hmm. So that's the question for you. And for Marco then, this is a really interesting idea, of course, the idea of translations as real sort of motors for change in languages, and it resonates with the I think a lot of what's happening in translation studies these days. It seems almost, I'm curious what you think about this. It seems like it almost requires this notion of translation as a real motive for change and development in languages. That it almost requires thinking in terms of, not in terms of sort of lexical items, but in terms of sentences. And I'm thinking especially about, thinking again about Ishiguro and his relationship with this English language translator Dostoevsky. And it was very much the rhythms of the sentences that he thought was tremendously, was a big influence on him. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, so why it was translated? Maybe it was also a reaction to the French translation, because there is this beautiful French edition that was done actually published in 2007, and actually earlier the novel itself was published in 1989, and it's in recent years more has been written, let's say, on Warszawski, also more interest in Israel, for example. This revival of Jewish studies is actually first in the United States, then it comes to Poland and Israel. But what I mentioned, for example, these examples that I gave concerning topography, this happens very often in Bashevis Singer's version from much earlier period, and this the examples that I gave about these villages near Warsaw actually comes from a translation by a well-known Yiddishist, and a very kind of careful edition that serves as a kind of on the reading list of main Yiddish courses, Ashtetl and other novellas. So it is not that it's just a kind of case that there is this bad translation by the publishing house, because of course you could also look at this translation from different point of view as a generally sloppy translation, but here I try to extract these kind of cultural elements that I think appear in various texts. And as far as this bad writing, in of course inverted commas, here it fits very well into it, because he was a very young writer. Actually, the Yiddish edition was published by also a publishing house almost created especially for publishing this novel, by Iche Meyer-Weissenberg, who was a recognized Yiddish writer and who was like a mentor of Warszawski. But the editing was very sloppy, even in the later edition done in Vilna or Vilnius, they state on the front page that the publishers don't take responsibility for proofreading or for the errors. So I don't know why it was never edited or corrected, but here the bad writings is in a sense that this is a kind of flow of ideas. And it's like, Theodor Dreiser, for example, has been often criticized, and also, a naturalist, for this kind of sloppiness in a sense, but which also gives, or this digressive manner of writing, but this gives this specific also rhythm to the text, and this multilingual character also gives this additional rhythm. So this is a great challenge for a translator. So of course it could be also discussed from different points of view here. Since the title of the conference is the word view, I sort of concentrated more on the how Eastern Europe and how Polish Jewish life is presented.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen, for making these connections to other examples that we already had at the conference here. So rhythm as an influence, not only on translation, but on thinking, feeling, on a way of experiencing the world, yeah? So on life, finally. So that is very explicitly Michenik's program, and I follow him on that. I really think that poetics, defined as such, would be then the interaction of the form of life and the form of language. There is the mutual relationship between the two. The way we talk will shape our way we see the world, we perceive it, and therefore also how the world is to us. Yeah? That is our access to language. Therefore, having a different rhythm or developing the rhythm only makes us to what we are and the world to what it is. So everybody has their own sort of doing that, and it's constantly shifting, obviously. But yeah, that's really a very, very big claim. Yeah? So really, it's not only the words, it's the way we talk that shapes us. And obviously, I mean, we can see that various levels. Yeah? People just talked differently in different historical situations. Yeah? There were fashions and so on. We have that very often. We have that nowadays that, I don't know, one TV series imposes certain expressions or certain intonations, yeah, and all of a sudden everybody speaks like that, and of course everybody feels like that, and it's connected to a certain way of being. And if you listen to recordings of how people spoke, I don't know, in the 1950s or in the 1940s in Germany or the 30s or whatever, you feel that there's a very different conception of the world in that kind of speaking, intonation, rhythm, and so on. It's not the words, it's the rhythm, it's the way of speaking. It's very difficult to grasp, as I already pointed out yesterday, but it is real. It doesn't exist.
Okay, thank you. Professor Underhelm.
Thanks. I'm not going to pretend this is a question, but I'm seeing, usually we see bridges built between people, but I'm seeing triangles all over the place here, so I want to bring your two papers together and say, that, of course, we all find them fascinating. These are papers that we'll use with our graduate students. You do a very fascinating and original take on the issue, which is strange for someone who's like you, spent 25 years on it. And I thought your paper on Berman was very interesting, and the way you analyse, you do a study in bad writing, and you seem to jump in and shows this detail and shows this detail. We might not trust you because you can do that, but when you give us one simple sentence, I just find, as did the girls, not possible, no register. Delightful intelligence in their eyes, just not even coupling those two words for a girl, it's just not possible. Approximately half a year older than I was, just inconceivable. Inconceivable bad writing in rhythm, in the way words are put together in sort of a mixed way. So I really enjoyed that. What you said was very just, and we should say this because we're the French sort of angle, that the French translation is good and the English translation is bad. English translation gets rid of the song. What does the French song do? And that's where I would sort of say there's a link, and a necessary link, in the miscomprehension between you and Elżbieta Tabakowska, so that on the slick salons yesterday, and the fact that you and Marco are not coinciding on this is significant. It's in one of the elements of Berman's, the rhythm and the organisation of sound patterning is something you didn't look at. But this will be very, very important for Berman, because Marco neglected to say this, that he is making a student, I'm making a student. He forgot to say that Berman is making a student. And the foreignizing ethnocentric debate, for me, I've argued this for the last 10 years, comes from Nation, and the fact that Berman does not, like Marco and me, we had a good doctor father. You know, he was a good father to us. He was a much younger man with Berman, and there seems to be a competition there. In any case, the Thinker's Nation, of your 12 examples, 8 or 9 of them come directly from Nation, and that is not known simply in the Western world, because Berman's so good. It's as a sort of pedagogical and as a good as a practitioner. So I think there's to come back to the French translation. What Berman will like about the French translation, and why it's a Berman-like translation, is because you've got words like pognon, cash. You've got these as rhymes at the end of lines. You're rhyming pognon, on va, go, cash, go get the cash. Smugglers, this makes sense. Bonheur, en chœur, all together in chœur, not the chœur here, but in choir, together, happiness. These are meaningful links, and these are the meaningful links. And this is what Marco said a few times. I don't think anyone got that. We complained a few times very, very politely that we weren't talking about these questions of rhythm. For Masonic rhythm is not about it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. It's not measurable. It's not. This is the shape and movement, the meaningful movement of the organisation of speech is what interests him. He talks about the sign. That's a French problem. Is the French essentialising the sign? What we're talking about here in Taras's paper is signs, the interaction of signs, but that is interpretive, and that's already textual, and it's no longer listening to the word, which is what Marco wants to do. Not listen to the word, but the words and the sentence. It would be just to simplify, or just to schematize what Marco's done, is stress that it's not about translating the word, it's about translating the sentence. In these cases make information, it's not about the sentence formation, it's the text. And the text is where the subject becomes. It's not about individuals, it's about people becoming in language. So I think that's what his paper put ahead. And there's a lot of things in your paper that I haven't seen initially, but I'm translated, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I see that as a confirmation. It's good to make this connection. Yeah, so I was struck also by your examples, and I think it's wonderful, and it's of course a necessary work done, but we should make a step further, go beyond that level of the world, where it's clearly, I mean, there are mistakes and so on, very shocking mistakes in the case that you presented, but how about the other element of translating and of what language does? It's not only a sign for something else that we communicate in that way. So language is more than just communication. It's creating meaning in itself beyond the level of references to signify things.
Yeah, actually you can write 5 papers, on this topic, and obviously comparing, and also, it's interesting why the French translation is very good. It's not foreignized translation. To some extent, it's also domesticated. But it was done by 2 Polish Jews who ended up in France, so they knew this word very well. Not to mention that the connection between the French word and the Polish word, the Russian word, is much closer. So lots of this cultural transfer is possible. And of course, you can analyze. Here I use Berman just some concept, but I didn't. My attempt wasn't to give a thorough analysis, because obviously you can look at any translation, this particular translation, at various levels. What interested me was especially this kind of the creation of Eastern Europe, topography, historical and geographical perception, not really the kind of the literary values of the novel, because this would be a completely different analysis.
Okay, well, last question, I suppose that was well.
Thank you very much. I want to refer a kind of common question to Marco. Back in 1822, Metropolitan Ivan Ovienko wrote that in religious translation, we should pay attention to Hebraic lingua poetic and Hellenic lingua poetic. So I met this idea a couple of times, rarely but regularly. And I'm always questioning myself and some other people, what does it mean? We don't speak about biblical translation, we speak about Bible-generated text, mainly prayers or religious hymns, right? What kind of Hebraic and Hellenic poetics can be found in Ukrainian, Polish, Dutch, German prayers and religious songs? Have you ever traced this idea of different kind of lingua poetics in those days? Thank you indeed.
If I understand your question correctly, then it would be exactly what I was talking about. Yeah, that in the Hebraic has certain ways of functioning, of organizing meaning, by the system of accent. And the entire criticism, both of Buber, Rosenzweig and Michenik, is that got lost. Yeah? So in our entire Christian tradition, people do not pay attention to that. Mostly because they don't translate from the Hebrew, but from the Greek, in most cases. So already there, it was already lost in the first instance, and then in the second instance even more so. So they don't pay attention to language as such. They pay attention to words, they try to translate that, and then adapt that to something that's already there, or sometimes, I mean, in Luther's case, very clearly, Luther has formed German language grammatically, really reinvented German, or invented it as a standardized language with his translation. So they do something, but it's something else. And now if you want to go back, and it will always be something else to a certain degree, but if you say, well, there is a particular way of functioning in the Hebrew Bible, and we try to somehow transpose that into other language systems in order to enrich other languages and become aware of certain things that we are not aware of in our episteme. Our entire system of knowledge does not consider that. We function in this idea of science. We don't even take that into consideration. And therefore it's so difficult for us to speak about these things. We don't have the concepts for that. We should try to develop concepts like the continuous, like rhythm and so on, in order to grasp that what is indeed going on. I think if we think about it, we will acknowledge that it is going on. We just cannot really conceptualize it very well and work with it. That's why we avoid it. And that's why this system of language theory constantly reinforces itself and believes that it covers everything. But just because we block out things. And these blind angles should be now finally reintegrated in our way of thinking, because it is present even in our way of thinking, we just don't know it. So making us aware of what we are doing, that's what I tried to contribute a little bit here by referring to engineering.
Thank you. I think that I can claim only one sample, because I was just trying to think over the point. So I can say that in Paternoster, right, when we have this and, right, which in Church Slavon, in Old Church Slavon, this and is not only and, it also means just let, right? So it's da, when we say this, da prejde carstvo, da bude tvoje carstvo. So da is not only just this and, it's also this pushing force, right? Let it happen, right? And it refers, so I would say that this is a sample of Hebraic. So I don't know Hebrew, I studied Arabic, right? And I can understand that this is wow, which is done into our commas, right? Which has this just purely punctuational function, but at the same time it has this pure and strictly semantical and poetical division of word, or let's say phrase understanding in the oral culture, but not in the written culture. And whether it's so important nowadays, this is really just an open question for you. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good example. Sorry.
Okay.
That's a very good example, because there's, you have the repetition. So, of course, very often you have to find other equivalences. You cannot, in translation in another language, completely reproduce that. Yeah, then you would simply get the Hebrew text. It just doesn't work. But having the same kind of structure with another construction, yeah, having the repetition in the da, yeah, it's of course a possibility of rendering the rhythm of the original. Yeah. Good example. So there are, of course, lots of great writers and translators who have done a lot of good work on it.
I'm not only sorry to have to stop this, I'm very sorry. But coffee's waiting for us. See you back in 20 minutes. Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Marco.
In this session we've got two presentations. The very first one will be delivered by Barbara Gawrońska-Peterson and Susan Erdman. I do not have to introduce Professor Gawrońska-Peterson because we did it 2 days ago and we know her already. As far as Susan Erdman is concerned, where Susan is senior lecturer at the University of Agder, Kristiansand, Norway. And she works in the Department of Foreign Languages and Translation. She's also involved in the translation and intercultural communication research group. So, ladies, the floor is yours.
Oh, we're going to have a sort of awkward tag team lecturing, I suspect, here. The title is Norwegian Translations of Anne of Green Gables, Descriptions, Associations, and Manipulations. I'm not sure I like that term, manipulation, but we'll come back to what's going on in this text. What we're going to look at is really a translation history of a really popular book, Anne of Green Gables, within the Norwegian context. It's a book that has been translated several times, but where one translation has dominated really for half a century. So we're going to look at the nature of that very popular translation because it's also a very peculiar translation. Can you change slides, Barbara? Anne, obviously it was published in Canada in 1908. The first translation was in 1918. And this is where we get the Norwegian title, Anna fra Berkeley. Berkeley isn't really a word. It's a kind of an adjective ending on the word birch for a birch tree. So it's Anne of Birchley. And it's not the Danish title that one might expect because it was translated first in Danish. But there it was Anna fra Grønnebakken, from the Green Hill. So this is a specifically Norwegian title that it's been given. And Elisa Horn translated it in 1918, and the date is pretty significant. And it was about 77% of the original. That translation only went in one edition, so it was translated in 1918, and then it kind of vanished from the world. And in the next slide, we'll talk about why that translation vanished so quickly, or vanished entirely. The translation that we're going to concentrate on is Mimi Sverdrup Lunden's translator. And she's a very interesting character. She's a member of a important pedagogical and literary family from Christiania, from Oslo. The family was not a radical family, but she herself became radicalized in reaction to the revolution in Russia and socialist movements throughout Europe. And also sort of her own history. She was essentially fired from her job as a pedagogue when she got married, and she took that to heart. And so she became a sort of socialist feminist agitator. She has what in Norway was called a light pen. So she wrote a number of tracts that were about the status of women in Norway. And this is a sort of edition of one of her more famous books, The Woman and the Machine. And it was about the status of working class women when work had been taken over by machines. What would happen to their ability to feed their families, their ability to exist in a working life. She worked as a translator. She translated, for example, Little Lord Fauntleroy and some other children's books that were specifically used in educational context. And she translated Anna fra Björkeli. You'll notice the change in the spelling. And again, this is kind of a significant part of what we're doing. And that was translated in 1940, which is another significant date in terms of Norwegian language planning and Norwegian language history. This particular translation is 52% or 48%, depending on who you believe, of the original. So you'll notice that it's quite a bit less from the original translation of 77% of the text. So it's very peculiar that essentially half of the original book becomes Sverdrup Lunden's text. It is reprinted. We say several, but it's actually reprinted constantly. There is another edition by Wenche Eng in 1982, and it comes out in a translation that's used specifically in the schools. It's a cheap paperback with lots of typographical errors, misprints, that kind of thing. But then Sverdrup Lunden's 1940 translation is then translated twice after the publication of the Eng translation in 82. So Eng has what one might expect, a sort of modern translation, 100% of the text, following sort of contemporary translation ethics, but that translation actually vanishes in favor of the 50% Sverdrup London text. And it's not just the case that this is children's literature and it was an abridged edition used for children in the classroom. This is actually the Anne that people of my mother's generation and people of my generation grew up with. This is the only Anne they knew, was this 1940 Sverdrup London Anne. A more recent and sort of, I guess you'd call following normal translation procedures version has come up in 2014. The dates are important because Norwegian has a love affair with standardization, but also a love affair with diversity. The Norwegian language resists standardization. It is a language of dialects, and these dialects are not just phonetically realized and lexically realized, they're also there in grammar. There are 2 written standards of Norwegian, and so to some extent we can think of the Norwegian language as a product of the Norwegian people that is continually being reworked. It is a national artifact that all Norwegians are invited, at least in theory, to participate in. Now, in reality, there are some people who are not allowed to participate in this particular project, the creation of the Norwegian language. But that's kind of another paper. So let's look at the dates really quickly, because I did suggest that the dates are important. You know, Norway becomes independent in 1814. And there are some early experiments to separate Norwegian from Danish, you know, as a written language in 1840. Ivar Aasen is this character who traveled around Norway listening to dialects and trying to create a standard of written Norwegian that was based on the way people actually spoke. Because the standard written language was Danish, and it didn't bear a terribly close relationship to the way that ordinary people actually used Norwegian. So then there were 3 language reforms, sort of official attempts to create a written standard for Norway, for the entire country. There's the 1907 one, but significantly there's the 1917 language reform. The 1917 language reform is what Elisa Horn's 1918 edition of Anne of Green Gables is based upon. And so this is an attempt to use grammatical structures and linguistic structures that are specific to Norwegian and no longer Danish. Now, Elisa Horn does not create a 1917 reform text. She uses elements of the 1917 reform, but some elements remain part of the Danish system. So, for example, it is in 1917 that the A with the circle over the top, the Å, comes into being. Elisa Horn rejects that and uses the double A to realize that sound in her text. So it does come off as a little bit old-fashioned already by the time it's published, because it doesn't conform to this reform. And then, of course, the important reform we're going to talk about, the 1938 reform. This reform creates a kind of bokmål standard for the Norwegian language. That's the language of the book, the dominant written standard in Norwegian to this day. And Mimi Sverdrup Lundin, as a pedagogue, explicitly wants to rewrite Anne in this language, no longer using the sort of Dano-Norwegian of Elisa Horn. So Anne, the Canadian heroine, can become a more authentically, Anna, the Norwegian heroine in the modern Norwegian language, written language.
So let's travel to Poland now, and our current work on Anne of Green Gables was intended to be related to my previous work on the Polish translations of this book. Well, the classical one is by Bernsteinowa. Well, as you see, it occurred only 4 years after the original was published. And this is kind of a classical Anne, this Anne that my generation has grown, and the generation of my parents has grown up with. But in 2003, a new translation was published by Agnieszka Kuc, and in a previous paper, I tried to compare those two translations, especially with a focus on adjectives. A characteristic feature of Montgomery's style is an abundance of adjectives. There's a lot of nature descriptions, and well, also in dialogues, especially in ants, the main characters, replicas. There's a lot of adjectives, and some of them have a kind of poetic touch, and they are often synesthetic, appealing to different senses. There is a wide range also of adjectives referring to colors, and often not very frequent adjectives, as I mentioned, with a kind of poetic touch. Well, I was interested in whether the choice of adjectives in the new translation was really motivated, because as you see here in translation 1 and translation 2, there is some difference with regard to adjectives. Strangely enough, in translation 2, this new one by Agnieszka Kutz, some of the adjectives do not sound in a very modern way. For example, wartki, as a translation of headlong or intricate, has rather an ancient touch to me. Anyway, I performed a psycholinguistic experiment, an association test, and the informants were school kids aged 12, between 12 and 13, so the same age as the main character. I had, around 100 school kids, and they were presented those adjectives as a mixture and not as a list. The adjectives were shown on the screen, so 2 seconds stimulus and then 7-8 seconds right and the next one. Previous work on associations, especially for English, for example, the work by Jane Aitchison, by George Miller, Christine Feldbaum, and other people around this big English electronic lexicon WordNet, show that associations of adjectives in English will show statistically kind of different patterns that common associations to nouns. So if you give people a noun as a stimulus, I mean school children or grown-up people, then normally the response would be a synonym or a superordinated term or something for the same semantic field, but normally a noun. But, for English, the results show that if you give adjective as stimulus, the response is often the noun, which frequently collocates with the adjective. Sometimes you can get antonyms or synonyms, but mostly nominal collocates. So I had a kind of double purpose with this test. One purpose was to check whether Polish kids will display the same association patterns in terms of word classes and semantics. And the second one was to check whether which adjectives are cognitively anchored, which adjectives have, what kind of associations they have in the mental lexicon of the kids. And the main idea was that if the association patterns in informants show nouns that are semantically close to the nouns that occur in the text. So, for example, if you have this wartki swawolny, kapryśny, and if it will be related somehow to, this word have, kind of special collocates, they refer to water, it's running water. So if the association patterns will include associations to water, brooks and rivers and so on, it would be an evidence that the kids kind of understand this. Well, the results confirmed the fact that kids mostly respond with nouns, and there was no significant difference in this cognitive anchoring of those adjectives used by translator 1 and translator 2. The only difference concerned some poetic unusual terms referring to colors. So if in some adjectives the recurrent pattern of association was that the only associations were phonetically triggered, like szafranowy szafa or szafranowy szarfa. So there was no semantic connection, the response were only phonetically similar, which indicates that, well, the children probably don't understand this adjective. Well, then there's another study comparing these two Polish translations, focusing on terms related to religion, especially Protestant religion, because this is, well, an important topic in the book. When I discussed this issue with Susan, we decided that, well, before we read the Norwegian translations, well, let's either repeat my association test with Norwegian kids and this classical translation and the new translation, or check those Protestant and religious terms in those two translations. And, well, it seemed to be a good idea, but it turned out that it was impossible to turn into reality, because in this old classical translation, most of the adjectives and most of the religious terms were simply omitted. So,
for my purposes, the interest is, I mean, we have a pretty good beat as to why Mimi Sverdrup, why Mimi Sverdrup Lundin would have translated in this way. She has another book called The Long Working Day, which is also about sort of the situation of women's sort of double roles in the workplace and at home, where she issues, and this is my translation, that the real danger for women is lies, fairy tales, dreams, poetry. Men have used so much to keep women, their competitors, in their place. So she has this notion that any kind of fanciness, fairy tales, dreams, poetry, religion, all of this has been used by men to keep women in a subordinate position. So in that case, it makes it sort of peculiar. Why is she going to translate Anne of Green Gables? Because if you know Anne, she is a very fanciful young woman. She dreams of nothing if not a white wedding dress, as she repeats over and again. Her way of coping with her horrible reality is, she says, to dream it away. So Sverdrup Lundin has chosen a strange heroine, given that she has this antipathy to lies, dreams, fairy tales, and fantasy. So we see here Anne saying, "It's always been one of my dreams to live near a brook. I never expected I would, though. Dreams don't often come true, do they? Why? Because it sounds so nice and romantic, just as if I were a hero in a book, you know. I'm so fond of romantic things. And a graveyard full of buried hopes is as romantic as one can imagine, isn't it?" You know, so she has this tremendous 19th century morbid romanticism. Yeah. There's been one real article looking at Mimi Sverdrup Lundin's peculiar translation, and it looks at the image of women in the book specifically. Now this is something that even Elisa Horn's far more standardized translation had difficulties with. So we see Montgomery. She describes a situation at the orphanage where Anne is originally. All the girls began to cry, one after another. Of course, the boys didn't cry. And in 1918, Elisa Horn, you know, she says, "Hun brosti gråt, så begynte de andra." She began to cry, and so the others also. The boys naturally didn't cry. So it's already a bit toned down from the original English version. But by the time Sverdrup Lundin gets to it, it's "Och så gråt vi fryktelig allesammen." So we all broke out in tears. The boys are now crying with the girls. So there's a pretty clear ideological commitment in a translation like that, right? There are some chapters that are omitted entirely, and they're the ones having to do with what you might call everyday religiosity. So Anne's impression of Sunday school, Anne gets a fancy new dress, she gets sent to church, and in the Mimi Sverdrup London, she gets a new dress, but she goes to meet her friend, the neighbor girl Diana. There's another chapter, Anne is invited out to tea, and in this particular chapter, it's not just anybody's tea party, it's the minister's wife. The minister has a lovely young wife, and Anne is invited over to tea. Well, this doesn't happen, so there's no drinking tea with the vicar's wife in Sverdrup, London. And in fact, many of the religious everyday references from the town that she's in are simply omitted. We see some other places where paragraphs are omitted or they're very compromised, and a lot of them having to do with this minister and his wife. A minister with a wife was a lawful object of curiosity in a quiet country settlement where sensations were few and far between. The new minister and his wife were a young, pleasant-faced couple still on their honeymoon and full of good and beautiful enthusiasm for their chosen life work. We see Elisa Horn, she's already making it shorter. The new priest and his wife were young and worthy of being loved, and they were still celebrating their honeymoon, and they were full of enthusiasm for their new calling. But Mimi Sverdrup London has the new priest was named Alan. He and his wife were young, and they were lovable, and they just got married. So any of this bit about their good and beautiful calling and honeymoon is completely taken out of this translation. Not to sort of go on and on, but you can see that it's consistent throughout the text. Don't you know it's terribly wicked not to say your prayers every night? I'm afraid you're a very bad little girl. We have Elisa Horn giving a sort of reasonably accurate translation, and then we have Mimi Sverdrup London. You aren't nice if you don't pray in the evening. So no terribly wicked and bad little girl going on there. She has turned it into a sort of more general statement. And this one I really like. If I really wanted to pray, I'll tell you what I do. I go out in a great big field all alone in the deep, deep woods, and I look up in the sky, up, into the lovely blue sky. It looks as if there was no end to its blueness, and I just feel a prayer. And by the time we get to Sverdrup London, I'd rather go out in the forest, the big forest, or a fine field and pray. So there's no up, there's no deep, there's none of these descriptive terms of the romantic religiosity that you see in the original. Likewise, Anne herself is very vain. She considers it the horror of her life that she has red hair, and her vanity is tied into religion. Her foster parents believe that vanity will get her sent to hell. So we see in the English, I'll never look at myself again until my hair grows, she explained passionately. And she righted the glass, yes, I will. I'll do penance for being wicked that way. And by the time we get to Sverdrup London, I will never look in the mirror again until my hair grows out. So there's no notion that she's doing penance for being wicked, that her hair has been cut off. And of course, people who don't have red hair don't know what trouble is. Mrs. Thomas told me that God made my red hair on purpose, and I've never cared about him since. So being born redheaded is a punishment for being bad. Mimi Sverdrup London turns that into folk with not red hair don't know what troubles are, don't know what cares are. So a lot of that is compromised. So we see consistently in Sverdrup London's translation that any mention of everyday religiosity, this whole world of Protestant punishment, sin, atonement, has been toned down or taken out entirely. But there's also a lot of poetry in Anne of Green Gables, so it's not all about religiosity, it's also about Anne's appreciation of other literary texts. And Anne wants to be a writer. So the English version of Anne of Green Gables is filled with references to other writers, and particularly to Romantic 19th century literature. One of the most sort of gratuitous cases of Mimi Sverdrup London having really a hard time dealing with this tendency, the literary tendency of Anne, is about Elaine. So here we have the English, Ruby ought to be Elaine because she is so fair and has such lovely long hair. Elaine had all her bright hair streaming down. This, of course, is from Tennyson. We see here the letter, all her bright hair streaming down. And all the coverlid was cloth of gold drawn to her waist, and she herself in white, all but her face, and the clear-featured face was lovely. for she did not seem as dead, but fast asleep, and lay as though she smiled. So we have here in the Tennyson, this is Elaine. She's Elaine of Astolat. She is the Lady of Shalott that we all know from pre-Raphaelite literature, either dying or dead, floating in a canoe down a lily stream. And like we saw in the earlier quotation where she says, I think a graveyard is as romantic as possible, we have here the cult of 19th century. The most beautiful object is a dead woman, all being evoked in this image of Elaine of Astolat. Now, poor Sverdrup London, with her despising of poetry and dreams and fantasy, and certainly this kind of morbid fantasy, really must have struggled with what she's doing with this reference to Elaine. So Elisa Horn says, Ruby börde för hon har solis och har sånt under långt golden hair. Just like Elaine's hair came in waves. So a fairly reasonable translation of the original. Mimi Sverdrup London says, she has such beautiful light hair, just like we've been told about Elaine. We've been told about Elaine.
Yes,
yes.
this is our favorite.
This is our favorite. Here we have another element of the politics of Anne that gave Mimi Sverdrup London such difficulty is that Anne is not always charitable to other girls or other women. In fact, there's a lot of competition among the women in the book for who gets to be the most lovely, who the boys like, who has the nice dresses. And of course, someone like Sverdrup London, she was actually a teacher at an upper secondary school, is at pains to create a world where women are in cooperation with one another and not in competition. So we have this bit, and this is a very long section in the English. Ruby Gillis thinks of nothing but beaux, said Anne disdainfully. I simply can't talk about Josie Pye without making an uncharitable speech, so I never mention her again. I'm going to be as much like Mrs. Allen, that's the minister's wife, as I possibly can because I think she's so perfect. Mrs. Lynde says he just worships the ground she treads on. She doesn't really think it right for a minister to set his affections on so much a mortal being. But then Diana, even ministers are human and have their besetting sins. I mean, a very strange phrase, besetting sins. Just like everybody else, I had such an interesting talk with Mrs. Allen about besetting sins last Sunday. There are just a few things proper to talk about on Sunday, and it's one of them. My besetting sin is imagining too much and forgetting my duties. I'm striving very hard to overcome it. And now that I'm really 13, perhaps I'll get better. In 4 more years, I'll be able to put our hair up, said Diane. Alice Bell's 16, she's wearing hers up. I think that's ridiculous. I'll wait till I'm 17. So anyway, what you see, if I had Alice Bell's crooked nose, Anne said, I wouldn't, but there. So you see that here we have a combination of all the things that Sverdrup London is at pains to minimize in her translation. There's a sort of cattiness of this, gossiping about other girls and their appearances, this fetishization of the minister's young wife, and of fancy clothes. So Sverdrup London says, oh, she only thinks about love and that. Look, Diane, there's a rabbit. And she takes the reader, and then we're all looking at the rabbit. And we get none of the rest of this this dialogue, which in its own way, does remarkably convey a certain kind of, adolescent girl talk, right?
Well, I have to catch a train, so let's jump to the
So we'll jump to a conclusion so that Barbara can catch a train.
I jump over a couple of theoretical slides, but there is a quite nice paper on ideology in children's literature by Peter Hollingdale. He talks about a scale, of course a gliding scale, with 3 main levels, where the first one is when the author is explicitly telling the children what's right and what's wrong, I remember this kind of books from my elementary school in the communist Poland, when we were forced to read some Russian books where there always was a protagonist who was politically conscious and he always knew what's right and was, lecturing other kids on this. Then we have this next step, level 2, when there is no explicit wording of what's right, what's wrong, but rather artistic indication. So while those characters that have those more right, morally, ethically, politically right attitudes are simply more sympathetic and they evoke more positive associations. And then he talks also about level 3, about ideology encoded by the writer in an unconscious way, because everybody is a product of the environment. So, in my opinion, in the original Anne, level 2 dominates, because Anne, as you have seen from those examples, is not perfect. She is of course sympathetic, but she has shortcomings and faults, and makes mistakes, and her foster parents have don't like poetry and dreams, and sometimes they are right. But anyway, this general ideology of dreams and poetry as positive things in life dominates, but it is not stated explicitly. But what the translator does is, according to us, to disturb this level 2, because it's clear that Svendrup Lundin has her very clear ideological purpose in this book. And of course she is also a product of her time, this socialist revolution and feminism. But in this translation, the artistic level, this level 2, is really disturbed. And I suppose that after having seen our examples, you understand why it wasn't possible for us to repeat my association test with adjectives.
If I could say one more thing, one of the interesting things to me about this, I think it's pretty clear what Mimi Sverdrup Lundin is aiming at in this translation. So that's maybe not so interesting. What is interesting is the intense popularity of this translation, and the fact that it was reprinted several times after a sort of normal, modern kind of translation, Evenka Eng's was translated. So there's something about the Anne, although she's quite different from the Canadian Anne, there's something about this socialist heroine Anne that we get in Sverdrup Lundin that was very appealing to Norwegian women throughout the second half of the 20th century. So I don't think, it's easy to sort of make fun of some of these things, but obviously this Anne, the Anne we get in Sverdrup Lundin, resonates with, or at least did resonate, with an entire, really 2 generations of readerships, because this is a book that's typically read by, pre-adolescent girls and young women. Like I said, where it's easy to say that this is a bad translation, it is actually the most successful translation. It was actually a triumph of translation in Norway, because to last for 50 years without being retranslated is really an impressive feat. So,
thank you very much. Well, I just want, since I have a train to catch, I have to leave, and I wanted once again to thank Adam and all of you for this very, very interesting and inspiring conference. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now it's time for our last presentation in this session, last but not least, which is going to be delivered by Nigel Armstrong. Nigel Armstrong is Senior Lecturer in French at the University of Leeds, the United Kingdom. His current teaching and research focus on 2 related subject areas, that is sociolinguistic variation in contemporary spoken French, and the study of how language is used in popular culture from a translation perspective. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. How do I... There's a remote somewhere that you can use. Switch the slide. Yeah, it should be the remote somewhere here. Uh-oh. Maybe it's in my... Oh, it's right there.
Yeah, it's here.
Yeah. How does it work? Forward to this one. Okay. Yeah. With the arrows and that's...
Okay, so fantastic. Thank you. I just thought I'd put up a sort of piece of Bourdieu for you to ponder on while I'm giving you the sort of introduction to the talk. This is Bourdieu in all his sort of, I don't know, sinister splendor. I remember talking to Richard Nice once, and he was a translator of Bourdieu, and he was quite frank. He said, I often wonder whether I'm translating this properly. I frequently feel I don't really understand it. Bourdieu is not known for his clarity of expression. I think, to be fair to him, it's a bit of a French convention. There seems to be a feeling among French academics that if you're expressing yourself in a lucid sort of way, then you're a bit simple-minded, perhaps. But certainly Bourdieu is a pretty good example of this tendency. When I was thinking about presenting this stuff from a Bourdieusian point of view, I felt a little bit uneasy. I think I mentioned to one of the postgrads yesterday. I was talking to some other academic, and I said I'm thinking of trying to do an update on Bourdieu's distinction for I think it's probably 40 years on, and she said something like, "Oh yeah, I think Bourdieu, that's a phase we all go through, I think, isn't it?" I don't want to spend this half hour, kicking Bourdieu. It would be, it's a shame to take the money, as we say in England. It'd be too easy. It's not difficult to criticise him, but at the same time, he's one of those people, it seems to me, who sort of obviously he was a public intellectual, and he was one of those people who was responsible for, in a way, for sort of creating the intellectual weather. And he was a Marxist, of course, or a Marxian, or Marxoid, or whatever suffix you want to put on the end of it. And he clearly he looked at. He seems to have looked at pretty much everything from that point of view. Marx is no longer taken seriously as an economist, is he? And I think it's fair to say that his ideas have been falsified empirically, to put it mildly. Nevertheless, the Marxist way of looking at things continues to sort of pervade the intellectual atmosphere, as I say, especially in the academy, I think, but also outside. The idea of capital, the idea of cultural capital is now, or social capital, has become a commonplace, hasn't it? I believe Bourdieu didn't invent the term social capital, but I suppose he must have helped to popularise it, and Bourdieu and his adherents. I'll talk about social capital in a little while, but the other sort of essential idea of Marxism has, it seems to me, really taken on, has been taken on board, and it's become, as I say, part of one of the basic assumptions that lots of people seem to have. The idea of life as a zero-sum game, if you like. There's got to be a winner, there's got to be a loser. And I was very happy to, when I was looking through the abstracts of this conference, to see that quite a few of you just don't, you don't see things in those terms. It's not necessary always, it seems to me, to see things as a competition. But it's an idea which is really, soaked in. It was mentioned yesterday, wasn't it, that Bourdieu was a great advocate of interdisciplinarity, yes. And I'm sure you've all he wrote a great deal, didn't he? He wrote, 30 books, I seem to remember, and 300 papers. That's pretty good going. He wrote on all sorts of topics. I'm sure everyone in this room has been aware of non-specialists sort of, I don't want to express it negatively, but let's say encroaching on your on one's specialism. In a discipline, isn't into being building bridges between disciplines can be great, but I'm sure you've all had the experience of some non-specialist talking about, well, linguistics in my case, and you get this feeling of irritation, don't you, when you realise they don't quite know what they're talking about. And I often get that feeling with Bourdieu, especially when he talks about language. We'll look at that again in a little while. If we look at this quotation, I genuinely appreciate your help with this. Actually, I must have read it several dozen times, and I still can't quite decide whether he's just saying the same thing twice or whether he's looking at the same thing from two different points of view. One of the helpful things that Bourdieu has done actually in linguistics is to bring in the idea of the legitimate language, la langue légitime, or légitimé, which is a better term than standard actually, I think, because one of the properties of the standard language is its ability to legitimize forms which hitherto had been non-standard. And it's if you talk about the standard language, that gives an idea of immobility, doesn't it? A sort of monolithic quality, which is quite wrong, because the standard language is not unchanging. The paradox, as I say, is that it is capable of absorbing what was non-standard into itself and transforming it into standard. So from that point of view, I think if we talk about the legitimate language, it's a more helpful term, and it seems to be due to Bourdieu, actually. The paradox of the imposition of legitimacy, it's hard to know whether the dominant feature appears as distinguished or noble because it is dominant, or because it has the privilege of defining blah blah blah, a privilege which is expressed precisely in its self-assurance, and this is all the Bourdieu stuff about how the middle classes or the upper classes are in a position of defining what is noble, if you like, distinguished, or whether it's only because it's dominant that it appears as endowed with these qualities and uniquely qualified. Is that saying the same thing twice, or is it? Is it not? I'm not sure, but it's a commonplace of sociolinguistics that there is no essential quality in any stretch of language, which is possible to look at from an aesthetic point of view. It just happens that the standard language has this prestige because it's borrowed that prestige from the speakers who control it. And the classic test, is ask a foreigner to listen to a stretch of standard language, standard English, shall we say, or as opposed to a stretch of Yorkshire dialect, and ask them which they think is nicer. They won't have any clue because they haven't got the ability to understand the standard non-standard system in England. If that question is already answered, if you like. Even though this sort of nonsense about the essential nobility of sort of prestigious things is still very much present in the popular imagination, if you like. Excuse me, I must just have a quick drink. The next bit illustrates my point about this interdisciplinary business. It's no accident that to designate the legitimate manners or taste, ordinary languages can tend to say manners or taste in the absolute sense, as grammarians say. Well, no, of course it's not an accident, or if it is an accident, it's a sort of accident of human psychology, if you like. But it's quite true, you know. In English, and I'm sure in other languages as well, you'll say he has manners, or he knows how to behave, or you say to a child, behave yourself. Obviously, as soon as you start to think about that, it's nonsense, isn't it? Behaviour is just something that we do. Underlying that is the idea of okay, behave. He knows how to behave. In other words, his behaviour is well, what would Bourdieu say? His behaviour is in line with our popular, I don't know, conception of a Christian gentleman or something like that, for an upper class, an upper class person. Is that true? Well, you don't know. You don't need to be tremendously versed in linguistics to be aware that that there are other ways of explaining this sort of thing, where the superordinate or the apparently neutral term comes to take on a positive acceptation. And in fact, there is a theory in psychology which is called the Pollyanna hypothesis, which basically just says, well, there's a strong psychosocial tendency to look on the bright side of life. Like, I don't know if you know Pollyanna, but there's a novel called Pollyanna, and the heroine was a notoriously cheerful sort of person. We therefore in English, for example, when we say I was impressed, the default interpretation there is I was favourably impressed, but that's not necessarily so, is it? We can say I was yes, I was greatly impressed in an ironical sort of way to express the opposite. And there are other double-edged adjectives in English like that, or very interesting or extraordinary, where if you use it ironically, you're in fact exploiting the fact that adjectives like that are in fact normally construed in a positive way, and that is due, according to the psychologists who formulated Pollyanna, there's a sort of, it's either a basic psychological tendency or there's sort of social pressure to look at things in a cheerful sort of way, which I deplore personally, but there you go. So I guess what I'm talking about in this paper is language, culture, worldview, but in a way a sort of language turned back on itself and tried to consider language attitudes, I suppose, as a sort of worldview. The way that people have attitudes towards language that are, I suppose, they just betray their attitudes towards other speakers, which clearly, is an ideology, isn't it, or a worldview. If we just look at another quotation here, so Bourdieu asks, what is it about the standard language? Is it noble because of some essential quality in the language, or is it does it enjoy prestige because the prestige of its users just reflect onto it? The sensible answer is the second one. We sort of respect prestige because it's powerful, and the behaviour of prestigious people becomes prestigious, including the language. Look at this though. This was from Wilde, who was Merton Professor of English Language in I think he was the predecessor of Tolkien, in fact, at Oxford. And what he says is that if it were possible to compare systematically, I wish I could do this in an RP, so if it were possible to compare systematically every vowel, sound in received gender, which is the, RP, received pronunciation, it's, the way the Queen speaks, with corresponding sound in a number of provincial and other dialects. Here we've got he's almost French here, isn't he, in his contempt for the provinces. I believe no unbiased listener, unbiased is good, isn't it, would hesitate in preferring it to, as the most pleasing and sonorous form and the best suited to the medium of poetry and oratory. This is the standard attitude towards to legitimate language. It's one of the characteristics, isn't it, of standard language. It's best suited for literature. Non-standard literature is pretty much by definition a contradiction. What can we say about something like this? It was written, admittedly, it was written 70 years ago. I suppose we can say that things have moved on since then. It's still pretty astonishing, though, isn't it? Here is a man who's a lexicographer who did linguistics. He was productive. He was a sort of, I guess, he himself would probably describe himself as a philologist, I think. But the lack of insight is astonishing. But I think this is only one of the more extreme examples of the language attitudes that you still have now, I think. I live in Leeds, which is in Yorkshire, in the north of England, and I was amazing. I was amazed. I was watching the TV not so long ago, and there's some little feature about how translating opera into the local dialect, into Yorkshire English, and it's quite funny actually. It was someone singing, that famous aria from Rigoletto, La Donna Immobile, in Yorkshire English. But what was amazing was the translator was constantly talking about the flat vowels of Yorkshire. Now, anyone who knows phonetics is aware that flat, there is no such thing as a flat vowel. It just has no phonetic reference at all. But it's what people always say, when they talk about Yorkshire. Oh, I hate the Yorkshire dialect. It's all this flat vowels. What you really say, of course, is that you don't like Yorkshire very much, I suppose. You don't. And in a way, it's sort of understandable. I think these are really social judgments. In a country like the UK, where regional dialects are very important, numerous studies have shown a ranking of the various dialects, and for some reason Birmingham always comes out at the bottom. I don't know why. It's always the least favoured. But it's perfectly understandable, as I say. I come from Newcastle in the northeast of England. I'm still fond of the dialect, but I think there's nothing, there's nothing rocket scientific about this. You grow up in a certain place, and the associations that you have for that place are usually very pleasant, aren't they? Let's face it, most people have a pleasant childhood. You're up to the age of 7 or something, completely carefree, and it's lovely. And you associate everything with that place. I grew up in a place called North Shields, which is by any objective standards a hole. It's not a very pleasant place. But I'm still fond of it. Then you move to Yorkshire, which is another Leeds, another post-industrial, grimy town, and objectively you've got no reason to like it, have you? So and that includes the dialect. When you move somewhere else, you pick up some of the local words, perhaps, but you wouldn't dream of trying to imitate the accent. There's just no motivation. Similarly, with apart from the fact it's difficult, unless you're a really good mimic. So yes, flat vowels, and we had a little glimpse of that yesterday, didn't we? When people were talking about one of the Slavic languages, I think, and you're basically saying, well, because was it Polish or Czech people talk about the dear little son, then that's a sort of, what's that in the jargon? I think it's a hyperchoristic term, isn't it? You know, sort of childish language. Therefore, there must be a bunch of children, you know. Or I think vodka is similar, isn't it? Doesn't vodka mean dear little water or something like that? Water.
Little water.
Water, little water, or water king, perhaps you might say. It's a term of endearment, I suppose, isn't it? I've heard it said about Russian, you know, because they have no definite articles, and I believe they don't use copulative verbs. Is that right? So the book the book is on the table would be something like book on table, you know. So that is put forward as an argument that Russian people must, in some sense, be rather primitive, you know. So it's exactly the same mindset, isn't it? You know, you're sort of operating in two directions, I suppose. You don't like the language. What you're really saying is you don't like the people. Or if you focus on some arbitrary aspect of the language, then you use that to give the people a good kicking. So even though this is this is an extreme example of the myth that upper class of social practices are in some way superior, it's still it's still pervasive. It's still a very commonplace, I think. Just moving on to an example of language change, I'd really just want to illustrate how I suppose just how the fact that a word in favour of Bourdieu is once again, you know, the idea that it's best to talk about the legitimate language rather than the standard language. This is there's that, and then there's also the different linguistic levels that it's possible to think about. This is from a novel called When the Wind Blows by Cyril Hare, and it's of interest, I think, because I think it's always interesting to see how linguistic change is exploited in literature. Cyril Hare was a barrister and a High Court judge, highly placed socially. Here we've got a bit of anti-women discourse, if you like. There's someone called Violet talking on the phone, and she's being described in the narrative on either side as being kittenish, and she's talking to her lover over the phone, and she's trying to win him round to her point of view. It's nice the way the author is using non-standard language to subtly, well, not all that subtly, actually, quite grossly denigrate what the woman is saying. Can't just nothing be done about it? Just appear, please, poor little Violet. Notice the spelling of poor. This was 49, about 60 years ago, 65 years, longer than that. When I want to talk about linguistic change with students in the UK, the first thing I always do is I write a poor on the board, P-O-O-R, and then I point to the nearest student and say, how do you pronounce that? Always, it's poor, okay? Poor. Now, this is just a linguistic change that is going on in English. It's pretty much complete now. I say poor. That is because the dialectologists in the room will know that it's a sort of, I don't know, it must be a change that's been radiating out from the southeast of England, I think. And like all of these things, you know, they radiate out and basically push the older forms into the sea. But it's still current where I come from, and it's also a generational thing. You know, I say poor and not poor. Almost all young people in England will now say poor, I think. My wife, who comes from the northwest, actually, she says poor, so that it's slightly, it's like a lot of these dialectological things, you know, it's quite complicated. It's obvious from the text here, though, that Hare himself would have said would have said poor, I think. And in fact, if you look at Daniel Jones's classic book, you know, the pronunciation of English, he indicates, I think it was just at the time when the change was starting to tip over, and more and more people were starting to say poor. He was saying that the older pronunciation in RP is poor, but it was just at that time when it was starting to be noticed and disapproved of that Hare was able to exploit this in a very, if you like, in a very powerful way. He's attributing this pronunciation to poor little Violet in order to denigrate her. You know, this woman is being childish, and this is one of the ways that it's being demonstrated. There's also the double negative as well. You notice there, can't just nothing be done? I don't think that's not really right. Is it? Can't anything be done? So there's a two-pronged attack there: grammar and pronunciation. As I said before, she's described as being kittenish, and I think that's if you like, a misogynistic term, isn't it? I think it's a term that's only ever applied to women. Sort of, you know, being playful in a irritating sort of way, I think is my understanding of kittenishness. But there's the further sort of connection, I think, between non-standard and the childish. I think, you know, that's a further association which is often comes along with you know, this stuff is working class, therefore it's got to be awful. And there's also quite often a sort of childish correlate as well, you know, which is you know, present in many people's minds, I think.
Nigel, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, thank you. So when we look at non-standard pronunciation like this, we it seems to me that we quite often judge it in sort of aesthetic terms, and as I said before, you know, I hate Yorkshire dialect. It's so ugly, it's so sloppy. You know, these terms for a linguist are meaningless. But what is of interest, of some interest in English, is the difference between grammar and pronunciation. It seems to me that quite often pronunciation, as I say, is judged in sort of aesthetic terms, whereas grammar is more of a cognitive thing. The sort of the popular argument would be, well, you know, if you look at this, the dog is barking. It's perfectly comprehensible, but as someone, you know, from the standard point of view, there's a problem there that needs to be fixed. And you think, sort of, well, if you can't get the verbs in English right, what can you get right? Because they're so easy, you know. So if you come out with this sort of stuff, you must be cognitively impaired in some way. Even though there are plenty of people in you know, the UK and in the US who have this what would you call it, non-standard subject-verb concord, I suppose, something like that. And it's also from a linguistic point of view, you know, it's there's a sort of dissonance. You know, Chomsky would probably say, well, you know, this is okay actually because here you've got the semantic information, dogs, and all that's being conveyed in the it's just grammatical information, which, you know, from a communicative point of view is not all that necessary. Do ordinary people have that perception? It's hard to know, you know, because that's a sort of technical linguistic point. But what is certain is, you know, lots of people will look on that very, very unfavourably and judge it worse than pronunciation, I would have thought. And this sort of stuff can only be used in a sort of jocular way, I think. The informant who used to say this was born in 1916, and he was in fact my father. And he used to say, God, me dogs is barking. By which he meant his feet were aching. Is anyone aware of that? Really? Wow. I thought it was I was starting to think it was sort of private family language or something.
No, but to go to market.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, and so again, I tend to sometimes ask students, what here's a sentence that is perfectly possible for to say in English. What would you say bothers you the most about this sentence? I would have thought that, because it's grammar. But plenty of people focus on this, me dogs, even though it was it's perfectly possible about 100 years ago to say me dogs. And in fact, this is one of the things that standardization has squeezed out of the language. This, of course, is very, very, very common. Running out of time, so I just wanted very quickly to look at things from a comparative linguistic point of view. These are just a few figures which illustrate the very sharp disjunction between in precisely this area of variation, and wherever English is spoken, it seems that not using the standard verb inflection is something that distinguishes, how can you say it, perhaps educated people from uneducated people who are people who've been influenced by the standard language. This is huge, lower middle class, upper working class to 70, enormous. Norwich in the UK and Detroit, even in America, where things are more, arguably more loose and democratic. There's still a big difference there. Grammar is one of those things that really spooks English people, English-speaking people, and this is what really does my head in. If you look at variable syntax in French, how can it be that one language tolerates variable syntax and another one doesn't? Anyone who knows French knows that it's formulating questions in French is a bit of a headache sometimes. And one of the reasons is that there's so many ways of doing it. These are quand venez-vous, when are you coming? These are, well, perhaps those first four are probably the four most common ways of doing it. This one is formal, this one is sort of neutral, I'd say, certainly in speech. Vous venez quand? That's more of a sort of echo question, isn't it? Je viens à 4 heures. Vous venez quand? That sort of thing. But it's still possible as an ordinary question, I think. And then quand vous venez, that's a sort of form that tends to raise eyebrows. It's a bit non-standard, that one. And finally, just from a translation perspective, if we look at problems of equivalence, I don't know if you've ever come across Zazie dans le métro. It's by a French writer called Raymond Queneau. D'où qui plus d'entend, which it's one of those famous first lines. It's a bit like the first line of Moby Dick or Swan's Way or something. D'où qui plus d'entend. And the context is that there's a fellow who's standing on the platform of the Gare Saint-Lazare, I think, or somewhere like that. And he's standing in a rather unwashed crowd. And he's saying to himself, d'où qui plus d'entend, sort of, d'où que, those of you know French, what do you think that means? How come they stink so much, do you think? D'où que, sort of, it's certainly, the point is, it's very non-standard to say d'où que. D'où que, d'où que tu viens, something like that. The standard English translation of this can't do anything with that. It can't do anything with d'où que, for the very simple and obvious reason is that we just don't have much variation in the formulation of questions in English. Not much, not nearly as much as in English, in French anyway. How can they do it? It's quite sort of ingenious, actually, isn't it? How can they stink so though? Miss out the third. That's a nifty idea, actually. So but what you're doing there is you're substituting variation in phonology for variation in grammar. This I always think is that's a very clever idea. Even though the pronunciation is the same, they're using a sort of informal bit of spelling to add informality to the text. So here you've got variation in grammar, which the translator is powerless. to do anything about that. It's got to be substituted by translation in pronunciation. As I said, what is really puzzling is what always puzzles me is what it must be like to be a French speaker who is comfortable with variable syntax, and it really is variable syntax, and it really is syntax as well, isn't it? In the sense of word order, as opposed to being an English speaker where that sort of thing is pretty much ruled out. What does it go to show? Well, I don't know. From a standardizing point of view, I suppose it sort of demonstrates that the standardizing process sort of latches onto things in a fairly arbitrary way, and it will exclude some things but leave others intact. That's pretty much all I wanted to say. Is I realised I was starting to get a bit incoherent towards the end there. Thank you very much. Sorry to have run over.
Right, so now it's time for discussion. Right, we've got half an hour. Susan, may I invite you here? Okay, John.
This is for Dr. Armstrong. It's really more of a comment. I just wanted to take issue with one of your sort of asides early on. In many ways, Marx is back among economists, and I'd cite Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. There's a lot of rethinking of Marx, not among neoclassical economists, but they never took him seriously. People who never took Marx seriously, surprised, don't take him seriously. Anybody who ever did, there's a lot of work going on that takes it very seriously. And related to that, I don't think that life is a zero-sum game is Marx's idea at all. That's what he says is the basic idea of capitalism. He's arguing precisely. I like Marx as an ethnographer of modern society. As an anthropologist, I think he did some very brilliant analyses of the functioning of modern society, the way you do with any society. And I think his fundamental argument is that life is not a zero-sum game, but that we think it is ideologically because of the way we live and because of the structures we live in. I'm very struck by your last example. Fine for that, yeah. Your last example, because as someone who grew up in the States, in the United States and sort of all across the United States, so I gather a very standard American accent with mostly Pittsburgh, probably. How can they stink so? That use of so seems very British and snobby to me. And in normal language, it would be something like, how come they stink so much?
Yeah.
But you would never use so in North America unless you were almost imitating it. So that sounds almost upper class.
Yeah, the translator was in fact British. Somebody called Barbara Wright, I think. So yeah, so I'm sure you're right. There's definitely a UK bias. Yeah. Thanks for that. I've never noticed that before. How can they stink so now? How can they?
Are there any further questions? Professor Candela?
I just have a question just for Susan. Which is interesting to compare. I wonder whether you have made any comparisons of this sort, and to compare a Swedish translation, because it must be, and then a Norwegian translation of the Gables. Because it seems to me that all these were religious, actually, were perhaps passages, if you will. I mean, perhaps could be have been, or perhaps were not exiles actually from the translation, because I understand, there's a great deal of perhaps politics politics that comes into it, and then, you know, of course, both the Norwegian state and the Swedish state now are welfare states that, you know, they take care of the people, so there is no much room for religion. Well, perhaps is that. Do you think? Do you happen to know? I'm just what Swedish, because there must be at least Swedish or Swedish translation. Right? Because it seems to be.
Yeah, no, that would be interesting. I haven't looked at the Swedish. I did look at the Danish translation because I wanted to make sure that Elisa Horn was actually writing in Norwegian, to be blunt. And the Norwegian does not do this kind of thing. It doesn't. I mean, the Danish does not take away the religious passages. If anything, they're. I mean, well, ask Karsten, but I feel that the sort of parochial, everyday religiosity that is in Anne is probably a more accepted feature of small-town life in Denmark than it would be in urban Christiana, you know, in 1940, in urban Oslo, which was so influenced by you know, political movements at that particular moment. But no, I haven't looked at the Swedish. It would be interesting to see. I do know that there have been many more translations of Anne into Swedish than into Norwegian, so you would have a lot of examples to look at.
Okay. Professor Frank,
I think maybe you answered this, but I was thinking along similar lines in terms of comparison, but I was thinking of the comparison if the book is as popular in Canada with young women and girls, right, as it is in Norway, that it would be interesting to do some, if you could find someone to collaborate with you, to see how the girls who read this would portray the protagonist in Norway and in Canada. I mean, what adjectives they would use, how would they view the character.
No, I shot my head. Yeah, that would be really interesting. I mean, Anne has an industry. I mean, there's an entire industry dedicated to Anne. And so, for example, Japan is obsessed with Anne. It has come out in many versions. They actually offer package tours to Prince Edward Island from Tokyo, where you can go and get married in Lucy Montgomery's house. So there are Japanese couples that go to this Atlantic island, you know, and celebrate the cult of Anne. And so there have been some studies as to, you know, why Anne in Japan, how does she resonate with young female culture in Japan. So it is interesting to see, and I guess that the Polish translation was virtually the same year that it was published in Canada. So they're almost simultaneous. I mean, they were sort of 6 months apart or 7 months apart. So the cult of Anne in its various national manifestations is a really interesting subject of study. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Mahavich.
Yeah, thank you. I had a little remark concerning what Barbara said. I don't know whether you can answer that, Susan. Sorry, I tried to quote her more or less. She said that only phonetically there are different adjectives which are similar there. So she gave some example for that, but they are not semantically perceivable. Yeah, the connection there. And she commented on that and was saying that would show that they probably, the translators would probably not understand these adjectives correctly. And I was wondering, and she didn't really give concretely the example about it, but I was wondering about whether they did that on purpose because they wanted to have this phonetic connection and therefore gave up a certain dimension of semantic meaning of the word by creating a semantic meaning of the sound. And then it would be exactly an example, and maybe a very conscious example, not a case of ignorance, for what I try to say, you know, that sometimes the meaning of rhythm and of sound can be stronger, can prime over the meaning of denotation. So that was just one question. I don't know whether you have the example that she had in mind. So that's one question. And for Nigel, I also have a question. I was wondering about your long quotation of Bourdieu at the start. And you were talking about this quotation in English, obviously, and you did not really comment much on the French. So from what we've seen in English, that was terrible warfare. Yeah? Very clearly so. I wonder, I would like to have heard a bit about the original, yeah, and then you did not really touch on that at all. Could you comment on that? Maybe in French, indeed, it would work differently. Apart from what you said very correctly, that there are different language attitudes and things are possible in French academia that are not possible in British academia, and possibly vice versa as well. So there are different attitudes, but still, even if Bourdieu was somebody who wrote a lot and should have maybe taken some more time from time to time to edit his own writing, that looked a bit suspicious to me. And if the translator admits that he didn't quite get it, and maybe there are some things which a French person would get. So I don't know whether you can.
Well, Barbara's examples are specifically Polish, which I don't speak, so so I can't reproduce that. But that was my impression when I spoke to her, and it's certainly the impression of the Norwegian. I mean, some of this doesn't, you know, some of these adjective strings that Lucy Montgomery wrote, they don't really have tremendous meaning. Eternal amethyst. I mean, what does it mean that amethyst is eternal? So they're clearly chosen for the sound. Because these are glamorous sounding words to this young girl. And so there are cases in the Norwegian where you also create these nonsense strings, so to speak, which are clearly based on the appeal of the sounds, a sort of enjoyment of the aesthetic pleasure of language rather than any kind of denotation. So you see that in the Norwegian anyway.
So then it would be perfectly legitimate to do that.
I believe it is. Okay.
Press and hold,
Yes,
try and hold it for a while. And then
It should work now.
I think it
okay, if you're an expert on that mic.
I've just done the same thing 5 times.
Or maybe the one on the left would be work better.
You can certainly use this one.
Sorry about this.
Yeah, whether it's better waffle in French or not, as you so admirably put it. I'm not sure. I mean, I used to use a stretch of Bourdieu where he was talking about the credit industry or something like that, and as an example of the difficulties of translating French, and it was remarkable because you had to wait for about at least 10 lines, I think, for the main verb. You just couldn't understand the sentence until you got that far into it. Yes, I don't think he's just not a very clear writer. You're possibly right, I think, when you say he wrote a lot and he was in too much of a hurry. I mean, there's a famous quotation of Pascal's, isn't there, where he says, I'm sorry to have written so much, but I haven't had time to write less. And it was, maybe that was his problem.
Okay, Professor Garnowska.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this paper on Anne of Green Gables, and I would like I think it would be interesting for our foreign guests, is that it's an extremely popular topic among Polish students. So that's how I've almost put a pen recently on the topic, like comparing different Polish translation of Anne of Green Gables, because there are dozens of them, and I'm sure at every department, but not to really discourage students, I try to encourage them to kind of add another language, especially at applied linguistics, like compare, let's say, English and German or English and Russian, or to compare the other parts, because fortunately Montgomery wrote more than 7 books, so there's still a lot to compare. But it's also quite interesting how the title itself, because here it refers in Norwegian to the trees, right? And in Polish it's actually an N of green hill. So it's also like a landscape, but the Green Gables very difficult to render into Polish. So it would be also interesting to compare how this title is rendered in different languages, and also the names. I wonder what this Diana's mother, do you remember how she was rendered into Norwegian?
I think they have the same names. There was no attempt to change the names into
Because it's very interesting also cultural and from what I am interested in, that her original, in the book, her name is Rachel, Miss Rachel.
That's not
In
Diana,
Polish,
that's Rachel Lynn.
Diana's mother. Diana's mother. Diana's mother is Rachel. And into Polish, everybody knows her as Małgorzata, which is Margaret. And it's kind of interesting because the translator, Zolia Bernsteinowa, was an assimilated Jewish woman. But she consciously avoided the name Rachela, because, which in this Canadian or Protestant milieu functions as a biblical name. In Polish, Rachela, in the early 20th century, would be a distinctly Jewish name. So no Christian women would be called Rachela. So everybody knows her as Małgorzata. So it's also very kind of like a interesting discovery for Polish students that word. Why are these names so different? So it also is kind of interesting if we do this like a map of Anne of Green Gables. That's what Henry Cardella suggested, comparing the Swedish in various languages.
No, she's Fru Rachel, so Mrs. Rachel, Mrs. Rachel Fru Rachel in the original. I mean in Sturgill London's. There's actually a big Norwegian tradition into changing names. So if you look at translations of Harry Potter, the names have all been Norwegianized or completely are unrecognizable from the originals. At least Dumbledore ends up being Humle Snur. So the names are quite different. But not in this. I think that the characters were sort of too beloved to start messing with them. And the names work fairly well. They're sort of standardized names that translate fairly well into Norwegian. But the title is interesting because, as I said, the Danish one is Grønnebakken, so it's green hill or green field, right? And the decision was made to not translate it that way into Norwegian. And I think it has to do with the fact that Green Gables is itself incomprehensible to an English audience. What is a gable and how does it get to be green? So it's clearly, it's evocative without being denotative in some ways in English. And so it's the same with Björkli. It's not really a word in Norwegian. You can't be Birchly. So I think it was an attempt to create a word that doesn't really mean anything but evokes something. The idea of being in this grove of white trees and being Birchly. But it doesn't really mean anything.
Doesn't it just mean the house? Green Gable.
Yeah, it does. It means the house, but obviously it also, is supposed to mean something, right? In some way.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, Anne of Green Gables, like Hawthorne's House of the Seven Gables.
Yeah.
Part of the story. What's interesting though is that Anne has got to be. Anne is a different Anne in Norwegian than she is in Canadian English, and Anne must be a different Anne in Polish as well, and Anne must be a quite different Anne in Japanese translation. As you mentioned, there's this huge industry, or there has been in the past, of tourists, Japanese tourists coming to PEI and this sacred place. So these are all different Annes, and this is just an amazing thing. And worth thinking about as we finish up the conference, the fact that these are all different books. So Anne of Green Gables, well, this book is written and this is the source of text. Nevertheless, they're all different books, and they all appeal in different ways to these different audiences, to these different language speakers. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, no, she's a character that has escaped in some ways. She lives her own life, Anne does. Yeah. She escaped her original little island. And she became this international superstar. But it's kind of peculiar as to how it is that this Canadian heroine, and her Canadianness is very much there, and how she became a sort of international stand-in for perky girl. It's interesting because why this particular book, why this particular character.
Okay, Professor Candela.
Actually, Naji, I have actually a question. Actually, if I may, I'd like to introduce some confusion more into the discourse.
Okay.
I mean, it has to do with the examples, especially the one example. And you referred to Chomsky, and the things like the dog. It was the dogs is barking. In fact, for Chomsky, it would be just ungrammatical. It's not even be anomalous but actually, if anything, anomalous perhaps, but ungrammatical. But having said that, I haven't said anything because in Chomsky actually wouldn't say anything. Because now the problem is, of course, from a semantic point of view, you could have either way. It's just like the police is searching, but it's of course it's a different kind of a noun.
Yeah.
The police is searching and the police are searching, okay? And then semantically, if you treat, the dogs as just as a pack of dogs, a pack of wolves, it should be the dogs, well, in fact, is barking. Each individual dog is barking. It's just like you have things like physics is. Why should you have physics are? As mathematics is. So that there's a great Wierzbicka is trying to sort some things out. But I'm not sure. Well, probably she would actually reject now the dogs is barking. But if you try, to somehow to twist those semantics around, then you might imagine, these dogs as forming a kind of, pack. So this is just perfectly okay to say, well, the dogs is barking. I mean, this is in fact now, from an historical perspective, now this is, this is dialectical form, I understand now. So this is, how people visualize now the whole scene, actually, right? Probably. So actually, it's, I'm thrown my way to say arms in despair, so I can't explain it. Essentially. Because semantic issues.
Yeah, I suppose you could just look at it from a functionalist point of view, couldn't you, and say, well, you've got two features there. Why have two when we can get away with one? So, it's just,
but you can't say the police is barking.
Police is.
No, because it's searching.
But you can say that, and it is a problem with Chomsky. Of course you can say the police is barking. You express something very clearly with that. And here's this very famous sentence which was curiously... It makes perfect sense. Yeah?
Del Ives has written 2 poems.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's a poem, and if you read it as a poem, it makes perfect sense. But of course, if you have that conception of language, formalistic conception of language, doesn't work. So again, it's a wrong idea about what language is and does. It is. So Chomsky is wrong.
Oh, he's settled back.
That's a powerful statement.
It's a social fact.
But they are wrong. They don't see what language does. They see only a small portion of what language does. And they are wrong by doing that.
Right.
Actually, the police is barking is fine in colloquial English because in it means man. Barking.
But then me dogs is barking. That's totally different.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes, that's right.
And I was just wondering if you have any insights into where that comes from.
It's odd, isn't it? Yes, it means my feet are sore.
Yeah.
My dogs are barking. No idea. Yeah.
But I think once you've imported dogs, right? Once you've taken dogs and you've made your toes and your feet dogs, which I think is well established, then it's natural that when they're agitated, they will be barking.
Yeah.
I mean,
they're barking from pain. Yeah.
you've extended your metaphor, perhaps, to the very edge of where it is.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have time for final question. Samuel?
Yeah, again, it's just a remark and a comment. Both the papers which I enjoyed, I think we all enjoyed the performance. The way you performed those voices with that ironic sort of distance there, that worked really well. I mean, we saw how much you were taken in by that, taken into, drawn into that. And I was so glad that I was going to have to read that, because you did. It's something that we couldn't do. I could maybe translate that, but you probably have to. You can translate that, thinking that, and embody the way you're really moving into that. The thing that really struck me, and it does resonate with Martha's paper, very different papers, very different texts, etc. But is the sound patterning, your response. Did you see what she did with that? It was the same patterning, da da da, which works how in English. It works actually in alternation. 3 stresses can be, under internal stresses demoted, and 3 unstressed syllables, those stress can be promoted. So you get a deep, deep woods, which go down. So deep, deep woods, and up, and she did go up. And I couldn't, you know, even to try to go up, you know, would turn me into this sort of feminine, sort of 13-year-old. You get a sensitivity there. There is a sort of gender question. So I really enjoyed that. And I thought that was part of the sound pattern that for you obviously is very meaningful for you in part of the identity. We are talking about very, very personal identity. I mean, when you're celebrating this great diversity of individuals, but Nigel's paper really takes us back to a crucial question, although he's ambivalent in his Marxism there because it's a Marxist paper and it said, hey, class, okay? Class, and the statement you make is important, and it's one that we are avoiding because we're in Poland in 2017. Tastes are not arbitrary, it's just a question of taste, makes no sense. You know, we're in hierarchies, social hierarchies, so just now just two small reflections, because you know, you're from North Shields and my grand's from South Shields, so there's not a big distinction there, but she knows she is, when you explained my grandmother's position, because she didn't speak Geordie, she had the intonation like you, because all of the marketing experiments have shown that the most seductive English accent is a light Geordie woman. So all the call centres go up to Newcastle. So you said yours, you're a light Geordie. Intonation like, well, don't you? You know? So there's that there. It's very, very attractive.
Posh Geordie, as they say.
You've got a posh Geordie accent, haven't you? And you know, what you think and what my grand thinks and what Borgia thinks is that we all think is that if you speak Geordie, you go to the pit. You know, you go down the pit in your work, you go down to the docks, and you don't want your son to go down the pit or to the docks, so you speak light Geordie, or sort of the Queen's English, with the diphthongs that you share and we share, because it's a Germanic, poor, stone, you know, that wings, veins, those air, those ones that, you know, you will get in, you know, all the Glasgow and sort of, those sort of southern social. So I mean, I think that taste question, that accent question, those are very, very, those papers should oppose, you should be disagreeing somewhere here, but they kind of fit together in a kind of way. Thanks.
If I can just tread on your toes a bit, I mean, the thing about how Anna has become this mythical figure and has evolved in different cultures, it's probably quite common, isn't it? Because I'm always amazed at how you know, James Bond has evolved. I mean, obviously he's very different in the books from the films, but you know, there was a great storm when Daniel Craig was chosen because he's blonde, you know, whereas the original Bond was dark. But we're now talking about sort of, well, is it time for a woman, James Bond? It's sort of, it's almost as if James Bond has become a national property, you know, and it needs, in some way, it needs to be, you know, representative of the country. There must be other sort of
Doctor Who.
Yeah, Doctor Who. That's right. Yeah, with the first woman Doctor Who. It's I mean, someone must have done something about how these mythical figures or iconic figures evolve, sort of in response to, well, social pressures, I suppose.
I suppose Rosalind has, right? I mean, you know, is Anne very different from the bear in some ways? You know, so it becomes taken up by various cultures and used for its own cultural purposes, while remaining some Anne-ness or some bearness or some Bondness. You know, they become mythical.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank our speakers, and I suppose it's high time I give the floor to the head of the organizing committee, Adam.
Thank you. I won't take too much of your time, but I do want to say a few words. First, a practical announcement. If anybody needs an invoice, contact the invoice man. Rafael is the invoice man, and he has these invoices there, so there's a chance to get it. And obviously I want to thank each and every one of you for coming over, for delivering your papers and participating in the conference. And I want to thank my collaborators, Agnieszka, Rafał, Konrad, and Katarzyna, Kasia here, who's done the the design of the poster and the book of abstract, and who's been the multimedia person throughout the conference. So I thank them all. Coming back to the panel discussion that we had last afternoon, Marco asked me how I was, and I can say how I am now. I feel tired but inspired. Inspired to, on the practical side, we've got this very preliminary arrangement with Pargrove Macmillan for a volume with the papers from the conference. If you feel like you still want to be a part of it, then you don't have to do anything, you're already there. If you feel like you want to redo your abstract, you have second thoughts, you can resend me. I've got your abstract all right, and they are fine, but you may feel that you want to change it. If you do, please resend it to me, and I will substitute the new version. Now it's time for me to produce a book proposal and to see how it is received by the publisher. And then I'm inspired, obviously, to keep in touch with each and every one of you through email and personal contact as much as possible, and to continue to debate on language, culture, worldview, and translation. And another question that came up yesterday was whether these worldviews are static or dynamic. I think what I have realized in the course of the conference is that they are much more dynamic than I thought they were. I mean, dynamic side of the worldview has always been part of my worldview, but I think there's a lot more dynamism or dynamicity to them that I thought they were. And it works on different levels. It's like, I would say it's like with the universe. The universe is a dynamic thing, but it's dynamic different ways on the human scale and on the galactic scale. Got the expanding universe, but it's not what we experience in everyday life. But it takes a keen eye to look at it and to recognize those dynamics. And yet another question that was asked was whether we looking at language in culture or culture in language. I think it's both. I think it's a matter of perspective, it's probably a matter of focus, and there's no contradiction to these two. Well, an obvious thing to say, kind of an obvious thing, would be to say that if you're more of an anthropologist, you look at culture and you see language as part of it. If you're a linguist, you look at language and try and find culture in it. And in fact, a little anecdote, I sometimes have these discussions with one of our colleagues here in the English department, who's in the cultural studies section, and I told him that as cultural linguists we look at language and we try to see culture in it. Then he said, well, it doesn't make any sense. What you're doing doesn't make any sense, because it's like looking at an apartment that you live in and trying to find an apartment block in your apartment. That's a complete reversal. What you're doing makes no sense to me. I thought it's a rather brilliant idea. In fact, that's exactly what we do. It's exactly what we do. So I think this is a wonderful analogy, and I will continue to use it. We're precisely looking at our apartments and trying to figure out how we can tell what is the nature of the larger thing that apartment is part of, and that is culture. So of course these are big questions, and the rabbit is always running away, chasing the rabbit all the time. But the value of chasing the rabbit is in the quest itself, rather than actually catching the rabbit. And one final thing that came to mind is that it's pretty banal. I mean, it appears it's very conspicuous in all of your papers that language is a serious thing. The worldview is a serious thing, but that we're not just arguing semantics. Not just semantics. Semantics is the crux of life, so to speak. It's the very core, the very center of life. Language is the very center of our lives. It's political on the one hand, so it's very serious in that sense, but it's also very private. It's something that we hold dear to our hearts, or blood, or kidneys, or livers, or you name it. So I thank all of you once again, and I wish you a safe journey home, or a good afternoon. I know some of you will be staying on for another night or two, so enjoy your time in Lublin, or wherever you'll be over the next few days, and get back home safely. Thank you.